Recording in progress.
Bona tarda, buenas tardes, good afternoon everyone. Com sabeu, avui estem al segon dia del 5è curs d'estiu de Sofía Corradi. Avui parlarem sobre agenda digital, regulació i sobirania tecnològica europea i tindrem primer una keynote speech per Dimitri Lorenzani, que ens acompanya aquí avui, i una taula rodona després. So thank you so much, Dimitri, for flying from Brussels to join us today. It's really a pleasure to have you. Dimitri Lorenzani is a member of the European Commission's Competitiveness Task Force, and he will give us a brief kind of a keynote speech with some points on Europe's competitiveness, and then we will have first a dialogue among the two of us, and we will open then the floor to all of you here and also those that are joining online. As always, thank you so much for joining us, for the European Commission and the Parliament, well, the office here in Barcelona for the support, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ines. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming in this very hot day. There is also air conditioning, so this might be one of the reasons why it's so full, but I hope it will also be interesting. More than a keynote, I wanted to give you a little bit some introductory remarks to let you have a feeling of what I'm doing in the Competitiveness Task Force of the European Commission, but also, and I'm always very proud to say it, also as a visiting professor of competitiveness and industrial policy at the College of Europe. My name is Dimitri Lorenzani. I was in the past member of cabinet of Maroš Šefčovič, Executive Vice President for the European Green Deal, currently Commissioner for Trade, and then one day I got a call from Mario Draghi who asked me to contribute to his report on the future of European competitiveness, which I was happy to accept. And then when the report was over, there was this big question, will the report end up in a drawer, or will the Commission do something with it? Will the Commission implement it? And the decision was taken to create, as of 1st of February, this new task force on competitiveness, whose main task is to implement the Draghi report, or at least the way in which the Commission, and we will discuss about this with Ines, has owned the recommendations of the Draghi report as a sort of line to take and homework for this mandate. This second von der Leyen mandate. I hope all is good. Okay, so I would like to start from really the basics, so to understand how competitiveness has become a North Star for the Commission's action during this mandate, which is important also in an increasingly complex and contested geopolitical environment and arena, and why this session is called Technological Sovereignty and Competitiveness. I simplify because closing the digital innovation gap is the first pillar, the first transformational imperative of the Draghi report, which proposes a new model, which is a model of innovation-based productivity. Now, let's start from the beginning. We all know that since let's say, the first digital revolution led by the internet, and at least since Europe missed out on the digital revolution, so for around 2 decades, the European economy has been losing ground vis-à-vis the US and China. And you can look at this using various indicators. The easiest one, of course, is GDP per capita, where we see, for instance, that the gap vis-à-vis the US has doubled over the past 2 decades, and at the same time we see that China has rapidly caught up with Europe and will soon surpass Europe. Now, the analysis put forward in the Draghi report was that this is largely due to a long-standing productivity gap, and that rekindling innovation, and especially technology and innovation-based productivity, is a priority to put Europe back on track. Now, what is the diagnosis that is put forward in the Draghi report? Well, it's actually quite simple. If you look at Europe, it's actually quite difficult to translate innovative ideas, to leverage a quite rich pool of talent, of skilled young people, which we have, into marketable technologies, and even most importantly, to integrate new technologies into existing business models and into mature leader sectors, of which we have actually quite good examples in Europe, robotics and other traditional industries. With regards to innovation in a series of future technologies, if we look at the data, we see that the US is doing significantly better than Europe, and that China is also catching up in many high growth markets. For instance, if we look at quantum market, we see that Europe is very strong in patenting, but also if we look at private investments, of course, the US is very much in the lead. If we look at public investment, as you can imagine, China, with its planned economy, is in the lead compared to Europe. Now, the Draghi report uses this expression, which I like to use, which is this middle technology trap. So Europe is trapped in a middle technology trap. It's defined as a vicious circle of low industrial dynamism, of prevalence of traditional sectors, and therefore low innovation and low investments, especially in softwares, in tangibles, in intellectual property rights. Now, this was a little bit analysis of the Draghi report. What happened in January 2025 was that the Commission presented its competitiveness compass, the first major initiative of the new Commission that was meant to take stock of the 176 recommendations put forward by the Draghi report in many areas, and I contributed to draft those recommendations related in particular to innovation and digital technologies, and set the direction of travel for the coming years by transforming them in a sort of set of flagship actions across the 3 transformational imperatives for Europe that were the same that were highlighted in the Draghi report: closing the innovation gap, a new plan for decarbonization and competitiveness, and increasing security and reducing excessive dependencies. Now, if we look at the first pillar, and of course I just don't want to give you just the analysis, but to give you a feeling of what is happening in the Commission, the first pillar, not by chance and not by surprise, and this is why we are here, focuses on this aspect of innovation and digital technologies. What we want to do under this pillar is to create the conditions and the environment for European companies, especially young digital companies, to thrive, to take industrial leadership in high-growth sectors. And this is why, for instance, the Commission has followed up on this pillar with a series of specific initiatives. One is the AI Continent Action Plan, that was adopted by the Commission on the 9th of April. It sets an ambitious roadmap of measures to transform Europe in the AI continent it deserves to be. I always say, that Europe puts forward many strategies. The competitiveness compass is the meta strategy that controls all the others. If you want, this is the strategy for digital, which is being followed up with specific policy initiatives. We will talk later, for instance, about AI gigafactories, the creation of these significantly powerful high computing centers in Europe that could rival with the US, but there is also an apply AI strategy that is coming in the future, how to integrate AI into various sectors of strength of Europe. We have also put forward a new startup and scale-up strategy that is meant to tackle the barriers for European companies, especially when they are in the startup phase, to grow. Financial barriers in particular, this was very strong in the Draghi report, and how this is done is also through a new scale-up fund, which has the ambition to become a 10 billion public-private investment vehicles, which should tackle something that is actually quite true in Europe, which is the lack of equity and venture capital. And then there is one other flagship initiative that I have to mention, because we work on this quite a lot in the Competitiveness Task Force, which is the 28th regime for European companies. We want these European companies to grow, to thrive, and especially when they grow and they thrive, they want to operate across borders. So we want them to be able to operate across borders under a single, unified, harmonized set of rules. Ideally, not just company law rules, but also employment rules, taxation rules, insolvency rules. I say ideally because the discussion is still ongoing, and this will be put forward between the end of 25 and the beginning of 2026. Now, this is the first pillar, but it's not the only pillar. The second pillar, I told you, is this joint plan for decarbonization and competitiveness. Well, why? Because if we look at the competitiveness of European companies, another important barrier is, for instance, provided by energy prices. We look at energy prices for the industrial sector. They are still 2 to 3 times higher in Europe compared, for instance, to the US. And this is, of course, a very important competitive drag. It's quite important, therefore, that the Commission has put forward, once again, a meta-strategy and strategy. Its main strategy for this plan, joint plan for decarbonization and competitiveness, which is called the Clean Industrial Deal. It was adopted last February, and it has a sort of implicit ambition to marry decarbonization with industrial competitiveness, especially in a series of sectors like clean technologies, like energy-intensive industries. There is also the potential support of a 100 billion euros industrial decarbonization bank, backed by Innovation Fund, ETS revenues, and InvestEU. There is also an intervention on stated rules, the CISAF, the Clean Industrial Deal State Aid Framework, which replaces the transitional framework for state aid, especially for clean technologies, and then a series of fast-track funding for clean techs, procurement reforms, supply chain strategies. There have also been dialogues that actually were inspired by the dialogues that we did at the time with Manuel Shapiro, who is here under Executive Vice President Shevchevich, dialogues in this case with the industry, done for specific sectors. In this case, at the time they were called, I think, Clean Transition Dialogues, and this time they were done with the automotive sector, with the steel and metal sector, and there is one ongoing on the chemical sector, and the final result is an action plan, what we want to do for these sectors specifically. And so this is the second pillar. Now, the third pillar is actually quite important, because we're here in a think tank that focuses a lot also on international aspects and international relations. I was telling Ines that my job is very much inward-looking, because I focus on the competitiveness of Europe, or what we should do to become stronger. But of course, there is a very strong international component to keep in mind. And the typical example is, of course, the aspect of strategic dependencies. How much Europe is dependent on third countries, not always like-minded countries, for the supply and of critical inputs for its industrial sector. The typical example that comes to mind to everybody is the critical raw materials. We look at the mining, processing, and extracting. Whatever graph you want to look at, you see any color. Imagine orange is China. You see a big orange bar. China, we depend on China very significantly for all these parts, for a significant amount of critical raw materials, such as rare earth minerals. There is, in addition to this, the aspect of unfair international competition. with the potential for international competitors abroad to be, for instance, shielded by competition or boosted by large amounts of public funding, so non-competitive practices. So here, the Commission proposes to intervene in various ways. One is reducing these excessive dependencies via a series of clean trade and investment partnership with third countries. So this is not a new thing, if you want. It's a trend that has started in 2020, actually, and it was very strongly highlighted also by the work of the foresighters in the European Commission, by the strategic foresight reports. This aspect of diversification, which is the clearest and quickest strategy in the short term, but also of developing domestic capacities. And for instance, in our to-do list, in the competitiveness compass for this third pillar, there is the aspect of public procurement. We want to introduce a European preference for public procurement, especially for critical sectors and technologies. You can imagine that this is a very big step. It's very controversial, if you want, politically, so we are working on it. But this shows a clear move towards what the foresighters at the time, and I also put it in an article, and this is also the core of my course at College of Europe, is this new industrial strategy focused on open strategic autonomy. We can go further into detail maybe later in the dialogue. But before closing, I want to give you something more than these three pillars, because what I think is important in the competitiveness compass and in what we are doing to implement it is this new way of working together in the Commission that the competitiveness compass offers. Now, if you look at the compass, it's not super easy to identify it. I mean, it just says there are 5 horizontal enablers, and horizontal enablers for competitiveness, so conditions that should be satisfied for competitiveness to be restored in Europe. One is the single market, the other one is money. We want to be able to finance investment. The other one is skills and quality jobs. Of course, we cannot imagine to boost our industrial ecosystem if we don't have the skills, and I see many young people here in this room, so I'm very happy. But 2 important others are simplification and coordination, and I want to close with this because it's a little bit at the heart of the work that we're doing in the task force, and then we can go more into the digital details. Now, as regards simplification, the Commission has put forward a new way of working together, which is trying to achieve its policy objective, its policy goals, including this first priority of the von der Leyen Commission, which is this North Star of competitiveness and sustainable prosperity, in the least burdensome way, introducing a series of simplification. When I was writing the Draghi report, I was also authoring the chapter on regulation and governance. I discussed with many stakeholders. You have no idea how many meetings I had with CEOs, and many highlighted that the regulatory and administrative burden in Europe is particularly significant, especially vis-à-vis other realities. I mean, this is, of course, partly explained also by the different regulatory environment. You look at Anu Bradford, the digital empires. Europe is a rights-based model. We can also go into more details later. But we have to find, I think, the right balance between the principle of precaution and the principle of innovation. And what the Commission has put forward in the competitiveness compass is a target of reducing all administrative costs, which is much more than reporting obligations, by 25% for all companies and by 35% for SMEs. And how is this done? Well, you will see this word quite a lot on the newspapers via omnibus packages. These are, these are new legislative proposals that touch upon various, mostly existing proposals with a specific goal of simplifying them. I think we have already approved 5, if I'm not mistaken. The most visible ones have been the first and the second, which touched upon sustainability reporting and investment. The first one in particular has reduced the scope of a series of pieces of legislation that were highlighted by some stakeholders as controversial in terms of regulatory burden in the past: CS3D, CSRD, and the taxonomy and CBAM, so reducing this sustainability reporting only to the largest companies that have the capacities and to do it, and are therefore those that can have the maximum benefit for Europe by implementing this legislation. It has been estimated that if adopted and implemented today, these first 2 omnibus packages would entail savings in administrative costs of 6.3 billion euros, and additional 50 billion euros of public and private investment capacity to support policy priorities through the simplification of InvestEU. which is the tool by which basically the Commission puts forward the guarantee, you know, and therefore via the implementing partners, private capital is leveraged. So this is the first point, simplification. And the last one, and I want to close my opening remarks, let's call it like this way, is coordination. Now, the aspect of coordination is very close to my heart because it was very clear in the Draghi report that one of the aspects that is holding back Europe compared to the US and China is the lack of scale. What Europe sometimes struggles to do is let's say, punch above its weight, to bring together and coordinate the policies at the EU level and at the national level, especially in the field of industrial and research policies. At the time with Professor Draghi, we had the idea, I mean, how do we move to a true European industrial policy? And the solution was this idea of a new competitiveness coordination tool, which at the time seemed very far away from what was happening in the Commission. And now instead I'm happy that one of the main tasks of the task force, of which I have the honor to be part, is trying to give a life to this competitiveness coordination tool, creating a framework that will allow the European coordination of EU level and national level industrial and research policies. This consists of two parts, if you want. One is the part of identification of multi-annual competitiveness priorities. What should we focus on? What is important? What should Europe invest its money in? The second one is how do we move from these priorities to specific projects? How you identify them, and what kind of coordination do you need? And this is a coordination in terms of industrial policy, but also coordination in terms of financing. How do you put together the money that is needed? It can be EU money, can be national money from the public budgets, can be private money to be leveraged, for instance, using EU guarantees. Are we there yet? Not quite, almost, but what we have been doing until now has been to focus on a series of pilot projects, pilot ideas that were announced in the Competitiveness Compass, but in the meantime have seen the light of day. And one, of course, which I'm proud because I'm also coordinating it, is the one on AI gigafactories. You remember that last February, President von der Leyen went to Paris, to the AI summit, and she said, well, I want to have the first AI gigafactories 5 times more powerful than the AI factories and comparable to those in the US. By the way, the US are still building them as well, by 2026. And therefore, what we have done is to take this as the first pilot of the competitiveness coordination tool. The coordination in terms of industrial policy has been done through a call for expression of interest in a Euro-HPC joint undertaking. So basically, it's a structure, treaty-based, that allows to bring together the Commission, the member states, and the private sector. And the results actually were just announced a few days ago. I think it was on Monday, if I'm not mistaken, by EVP Virkkunen. The results of this call for expression of interest have been overwhelming. We have had 76 proposals, take or leave, covering 16 member states for a total of 3 million GPUs, so basically the microprocessors that are needed for AI, unfortunately largely produced in the US. We don't have the capacity in Europe yet. We will discuss about this later. So a significant aspect of coordination that the joint undertaking seems to have been the right place, the right structure to provide. And second, a coordination of financing that is happening, will be happening as we go, as we try to find the right European grants. We try to push, let's say, the member states who have put forward these offers to use the national finances. Maybe there are RRF funds in the future, or there are cohesion funds to finance this, and especially being very happy to see that there has been a significant interest by the private sector. So private sector was already coming in the consortia that have put forward some offers, and it will try to boost more and more in terms of participation. So I've been a little bit long in terms of opening remarks, but why have I put this on the table? Well, first of all, to let you understand what I'm doing, so what I'm trying to coordinate in the Competitiveness Task Force, but also to tell you that especially in this difficult geopolitical context, I have this feeling that competitiveness is more and more a joint responsibility. Many people look at the Commission and they think that the Commission should do this. The competitiveness is a responsibility of the Commission. And instead, I believe that the main Draghi lesson is that if we want to avoid a slow agony, we should really put all the hands on deck and involve member states more and more, involve the private sector more and more in an honest dialogue to understand where the bottlenecks lie, what can be done together, and this is the spirit of the dialogues that probably will be an important part of the competitiveness coordination tool. But also being able to communicate to citizens a convincing narrative, because we are in a world that the strategic foresighters, already well before the Draghi report, called the world of a battle of narratives, a battle of models, and the battle of offers. And we see many offers, for instance, from China, Belt and Road Initiative, who puts on the table the best offer. You see it also now on the other side of the Atlantic. Here we want to put forward a European model that is also a plan and a will, where we can reactivate the animal spirits of entrepreneurship, where we can also reactivate citizenship, European citizenship towards competitiveness and technological sovereignty as a shared goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dimitri. I think this has been amazing. Let's take a moment. I think you just gave us a mapping exercise of everything that it's going through, that sometimes we don't even have the time to really focus on what's going on. And I think that this has been a marvelous example on everything and all the work that the Commission is doing.
Now we can focus on the fun. Now the boring part is over, and we can focus on the fun and brainstorm together.
No, but I think that you put many ideas on the table, and I'm gonna maybe start with some of the small ideas that you were throwing to me to take off. Yeah. One of the things that at least from the research part, or even in think tanks, what we like to think about Europe, it's also this Brussels effect, right? Very much focused on regulation. And the discussion has been going on if this regulation that the EU has been doing in the last years, for example, with the Digital Service Act, the Digital Markets Act, was kind of stifling this innovation, right? And I think that the fact that this competitiveness compass is focusing on innovation can open a discussion on how can we really reconcile this Brussels effect, this normative power that the EU had with the GDPR along the world, because many countries around the world copied and adopted our rules on this case, on data protection. How we can create a marriage with these regulations and innovation. Yeah,
this is a very important point. I would like to start from the new industrial strategy focused on open strategic autonomy, because this for me is the starting point, and I think that regulation is one of its legs. And this is also how I structure my course for my students, and I really believe in this. So I write about this, I tell my students, and I think that this is how we should go for it going forward. By the way, whatever I'm saying is not, I have to use the official disclaimer because there is this camera up there. It's not the official view of the European Commission. I come here with my views, especially as visiting professor at College of Europe. Now, when I talk about the new industrial strategy focused on open strategic autonomy, I'm referring to a broad trend that has happened in the thinking of the European Union, especially in the field of industrial policy, at least since 2020. It was mostly with the COVID crisis that we realized that Europe couldn't just import everything it needed from abroad, and that the model was very much focusing on and specializing in traditional industries and importing advanced technologies from abroad. A model that has worked for a very long time, and we thought that trade could be the solution that could boost our growth, and actually the Draghi report has a very good paragraph about this. For 20 years we realized that this was our main growth strategy, a strategy focused largely on trade, and then suddenly we realized that this was no longer the case. Now, between 2020 and 2021, the European Commission put forward an update of its new industrial strategy. First of all, the new industrial strategy, and then an update on the new industrial strategy. More or less 6 months of separation between the two, and between the two you see is a profound difference. And what has happened in between is the start of COVID. What has happened in between is the first strategic foresight report focused on resilience, charting the course towards a more resilient Europe. And you see that the narrative is changing. The narrative focuses more on resilience, on open strategic autonomy as the geopolitical dimension of resilience, and on competitiveness, especially sustainable competitiveness, because of course Europe wanted to chart the course towards net zero, which was, if you want, the big meta strategy of the first von der Leyen Commission, as much as the competitiveness compass is the meta strategy of the second von der Leyen Commission. Now, when we focus on open strategic autonomy, we look at the digital aspect. This is what we call tech sovereignty. When we want to achieve tech sovereignty, we have to focus also on regulation. Now, the aspect of being normative superpowers is also a significant part of Europe being able to chart its own third way. Europe, as I was explaining, is different from the states-driven model, if you want to call it like that is China, that on the market-driven model, that is the US wanting to minimize regulation and leaving companies freer to innovate. Its third way focuses on rights and on the European model. Now, if we look at the Draghi report, what the Draghi report tells us is that, especially in the technological field, there is a general feeling that the balance between the principle of precaution and the principle of innovation has been largely tilted towards the principle of precaution. It was actually the only part of the Draghi report, and not many people noticed, but it was the only part of the Draghi report that Mr. Draghi quoted verbatim during the press conference. He mentioned the fact that there are around 100 tech-oriented laws in Europe, around 270 digital regulators, often overlapping, and that this, of course, is one of the aspects, not the only aspect, but together with other aspects, this can be considered one of the reasons why, in terms of digital, in terms of technology, Europe has been slowly, gradually falling behind. The debate between striking the right balance between the principle of precaution and innovation is not certainly a new one, but it can and it should be achieved, especially if we have the ambition of achieving this innovation-based productivity model and putting Europe back on track. How do we do it? And I see in particular two ways to do it. One is more policy-based, so what are the policies that we implement? And the other one is more regulatory, so how do we do regulation? Now, in terms of how do we do policies, let me give you a specific example, the example of a digital world and especially AI. It's true that the Commission has decided to exert its normative superpower, its Brussels effect, by putting forward pioneering regulations, the first AI regulation in the world, the AI Act, but also the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, that have really shaped the way in which not only Europeans, but also international, US, especially tech giants have to deal with us. And why? Why is it the case? I mean, the Brussels effect comes from the fact that Europe is a trade superpower. Everybody has to deal with Europe, with its 500 million consumers. And this is why, for instance, many tech companies also not based in Europe will have an interest in complying with these rules in order to access the market. If it is true that this has been perceived as a tendency to give more weight to the principle of precaution, it's also true that the Commission has now put on the table a series of policies that seem to be tilted more towards the principle of innovation. For instance, the Apply AI strategy is a significant example. The focus now on AI gigafactories, they seem now to be focusing on that aspect on boosting investment, of boosting finances that is needed in order to develop our AI capacities, our capacities in advanced technologies, but doing it in a European way. So once you have defined the overall framework, how do you want AI to be in the European way, in a way that is compatible with our value, then you can boost your innovation, introduce your startup and scale-up strategy, and make sure these companies can grow and thrive. This is the first aspect. So how do we do policies, and what are the policies that we choose, and what is their ordering? So somehow I have the feeling that maybe in the past mandate there has been, especially in digital technologies, the need and the feeling that first we need to regulate what we are doing, to define what are the technologies that we want in Europe and what is compatible with our values and rights. And now we have all the instruments in place to boost innovation, maybe in some cases, by the way, also to go back on some of these regulations because we introduced them very early on, and maybe in some cases we gave them a testing trial period and we realized that some of them were too burdensome. Typical example being the Omnibus 1 on the CSRD and CS3D. the CSRD had 3 waves of application for various types of companies, and now the Commission has put forward a stop-the-clock proposal, which delays the entry into force by 2 years to allow the co-legislators to intervene on the overall amount of rules. So one might ask, so why do you introduce something and then you want to repeal it? Well, exactly because we wanted to introduce these very advanced forms of regulation, sometimes being the first ones in the world, and the testing and trial from the real world has led us to take different regulatory action and different policy action. And this links to my second point. The second point is how we regulate. How can you strike the best balance between the principle of precaution and the principle of innovation by introducing smart and agile forms of regulation? And this is very important. If you look at the literature, the smart and agile forms of regulation are classified by experts like, for instance, Andrea Renda. They include classic forms like co-regulation, guidelines for implementation, regulatory sandboxes, but also advanced one like regulatory hackathons and so on and so forth. Maybe let's take the most used and the simplest ones. I mean, co-regulation means that you involve the private sector in your regulatory efforts because you know that your regulation is mostly used by the private sector and that the private sector has the knowledge that as a public actor, as a public policymaker, you might lack. Guidelines for implementation is actually quite obvious. In this case, the policymaker intervenes to explain what is happening, what are the rules, what did I mean when I introduced this specific regulation, and you all know regulatory sandboxes. So creating a regulatory sandbox is to create a sort of safe environment where specific regulations do not apply for a specific period of time and under the explicit and tight supervision of the regulator for certain innovations to develop. The typical example, the first example, I think, of a successful regulatory sandbox was, for instance, in 2015 with the Financial Authority in the UK, that introduced a regulatory sandbox on open banking, which has led to many of the apps that they were using today on our phones for financial apps. And why am I mentioning all these instruments? Well, because the AI Act, that is often accused of being too tilted towards the principle of precaution, also, I think, is a good example of an attempt at introducing all these agile forms of regulations. It has embedded a form of co-regulation in the AI Pact. The Commission is basically talking to companies that will have to apply the AI Act and telling them, look, I introduced the rules with certain deadlines. I ask you to introduce these rules in advance, and we will then enter into a dialogue so you can tell us how these rules are affecting you. So, typical example of co-regulation. And this, of course, will influence the second aspect, guidelines to implementation. The Commission has, for instance, introduced, I think it's a code of conduct on high-risk AI systems in February 2025. There is now a code of conduct that has already been published as a draft, and it's coming soon on general purpose AI. So the Commission is explaining what was meant by the rules, sometimes perceived as complex by the operators that will have to apply them in specific aspects. For instance, the general purpose AI rules will apply as of August 2025, and therefore it's important for these operators that might be subject to these rules to understand how to apply them. And regulatory sandboxes, by I think it's August 2026, the regulation foresees that all member states should introduce an AI regulatory sandbox in order to be able to test innovations in the field of AI, exactly because the idea is let's not stifle innovation while, of course, respecting the regulatory standards that are meant to protect our values, to protect the European way, in this case, to AI. I have also to be sincere. At the moment, we have not seen big success of these AI sandboxes, so the development is a bit slow. I mention this because I think one of the few examples is the Spanish example, Caja de Arena, which is working well, but also showing the complexity of creating this AI regulatory sandbox. A regulatory sandbox, especially for advanced technologies, can be complex, especially for the regulator, especially for the public sector. because it requires a series of knowledge that the public operator might not have, because they refer to new technologies, to something that has not happened yet. So how we define these regulatory sandboxes in the best way. So to conclude, this has been, sorry, but it's been a little bit of a high flying because it's a very important topic. Normative superpower is the regulatory leg of open strategic autonomy. It is meant to be exercised by striking the best balance between the principle of precaution and the principle of innovation, and choosing the best order, the best sequencing of policies, but also the best forms of regulatory tools, especially giving priority to agile forms of regulatory tools. I've not mentioned foresight, which is also an agile form of regulation, especially in the agenda setting. I was member of cabinet in charge of strategic foresight, so it's very close to my heart, is the way, I think, to solve this dilemma and this conundrum.
No, thank you so much, Dimitri. It's fascinating. And I want to take this idea of the open strategic autonomy and this technological sovereignty that you were talking about, right? Yeah. Because regulation, as you said, is one of the pillars. But what are the other sectors that we need to be maybe less dependent? You were mentioning, for example, critical raw materials. You were talking about semiconductors. What should be the EU priorities to achieve, if we can?
So which areas?
Exactly.
It's a difficult question, and it's a very important one. I would start also here from the Draghi report and the competitiveness compass, because I was reflecting back on this concept of technological sovereignty. So when it was first introduced, and how we have used it in the Draghi report, because sometimes also these kind of events are a good occasion for me to go back and say, what have I written there? Why have I written something? Have I explained correctly? So I was looking a little bit back and checked, and the first time that we find a good definition of technological sovereignty, of which, let's say, I personally was sufficiently satisfied, is in 2020. It was a communication. Let me find it for you. Here. So here, so technological sovereignty starts from ensuring the integrity and resilience of our data infrastructure, networks and communications. It requires creating the right conditions for Europe to develop and deploy its own key capacities, reducing our dependencies on our parts of the globe for the most crucial technologies. Europe's ability to define its own rules and values in the digital age will be reinforced by these capacities. European technological sovereignty is not defined against anyone else, but by focusing on the needs of Europeans and on the European social model. The EU remains open to play with anybody who wants to play by its rules. So this is the first definition that I found in 2020 that was sufficiently satisfactory. Then, of course, this was taken forward by the 2020 Strategic Foresight Report, which focused on resilience, therefore on open strategic autonomy as its geopolitical leg, and therefore on technological sovereignty by saying that this is crucial part of the open strategic autonomy debate in the digital field specifically. And so I checked exactly what did we say in the competitiveness compass. The competitiveness compass and the Draghi report say to enhance technological sovereignty and competitiveness, Europe needs to be at the forefront of innovation in tech sectors that matter for tomorrow's economy. And then there is a list, such as artificial intelligence, semiconductor and quantum technologies, advanced materials, biotechnologies, clean energy technologies, robotics, space technologies, connected and autonomous mobility, and others. Now, and this, I want to start from this to reply to your question, because I noticed three things about this sentence. So first one, this list is open. So at the time of the Draghi report, we didn't know what these priorities were, and Dimitri doesn't know now either. So trying to reply to the questions, what are the priorities, has to be a dynamic reflection. If you do it in a static way, you can draw a list that is based on the past analysis, but necessarily you are looking back instead of looking forward. In order to do this in a future-proof and forward-looking manner, I believe that this should be based, and actually this is also quoting the Draghi report, on a granular tech foresight exercise. I think we should use more and more the horizon scanning and foresight capacities of the people that we have, the experts we have in the Commission, the Joint Research Centre, the DG RTD, DG GROW,
of looking into the future and understanding what technologies matter and will matter for the world economy in general, but also what technologies matter and will matter for Europe. What does it make sense for Europe to invest in? And here, I think we should go back to the model by Pierre-Alexandre Ballon, the model of complexity and relatedness. So what is this idea? Well, when we look at these technologies where we should focus our attention, this is also a little bit what I called earlier on multi-annual competitiveness priorities. What should we put our money on? What are the winning horses we should bet on? It's very important to understand where Europe could develop future comparative advantages based on its existing knowledge base, based on its existing industrial basis, and focusing especially on the most complex technologies. I found this analysis by Pierre-Alexandre beautiful, and I wish I had done it, so chapeau to Pierre-Alexandre. So most complex technologies like Internet of Things, for instance, or cloud, I mean, many of them are digital technologies, are those that are most difficult to be moved away because they require a certain basis, industrial basis and knowledge basis. And unfortunately, if you look, and there is a beautiful graph in the Draghi report, please have a look at it, but if you look at the most complex technologies, Europe is not in the lead. Europe is in the lead mostly in least complex technologies. But what matters is where could we do better in the future? So not where we have a comparative advantage today, but where we have the potential to develop this comparative advantage in the future. So personally, first observation, the list has to be open. The list should be informed by technological foresight, and there are quantitative and qualitative instruments like complexity that can help us close this gap. And I think this reflection is not sufficiently strong yet in the European Union. There have been some hints here and there, observatories for technologies, but what do we do with it? It's very important. And if we go back to the work of the foresighters in the European Commission, this is also why I accepted this job in the Draghi team, not only because he was my former prime minister and I consider him one of the best economists of our times, but also because I thought this is a continuation of the foresight work. We can finally embed foresight into policy making for real. We have been saying it, but it didn't have the strength to make an impact, and now it's having an impact through the competitiveness compass, through the Draghi recommendations, into the Commission work programs. Second observation about this list, I have three, apologies, but the second one is that it's outward looking. And this actually, you're an expert of China, so I said competitiveness is about us, but it's also about the others. When I looked at this list, I was rereading it, Ines gave me some homework from home, and I said, well, but this list overlaps significantly with another list, which is the list that in October 2023, the Commission wrote for the European Economic Security Strategy about high-risk technologies. In 2023, the Commission identified 4 high-risk areas that were AI, advanced semiconductors, quantum, and biotechnologies, in which it requested an impact assessment or an assessment with the member states in order to identify the potential need for measures including coordinated export controls, outbound investment screening, in addition to FDI screening, which is done under trade competencies, and also potential checks for R&D leakages. So these are technologies that in large part link to our security world. These are technologies which are considered also susceptible to technology leakage, dual-use concerns, potential threats to our economic and national security. So this is the second aspect that comes to my mind, of course, in addition to classic ones like clean techs, where Europe has had for a very long time an important comparative advantage. And the third observation, if you want, is the simplest. If you want this list, the items of this open list, outward-looking list, were also kind of no-brainers. In a sense, these were horizontal, general-purpose technologies that make sense to apply to all our sectors in order to boost our competitiveness. And this was a very strong idea of the Draghi report. In particular, I'm referring to AI and quantum. Mr. Draghi had this idea. I was writing the chapter on AI at the time, and he said, yeah, but this is not just a chapter, this is everything, you know? So this has to be a fil rouge. And indeed, I mean, if you look at the various chapters, there is a little box on AI in automotive, there is a little box on AI in pharma, and so on. The idea of this is we should apply these general purpose technologies everywhere, and in particular in our sectors of competitive strength for Europe, pharma, advanced robotics, in order to boost our competitiveness capacities. So this list is really very much about competitiveness, and it's also very much about technological sovereignty. So, very long reply to say, I don't know, maybe this is the answer, but I have very clear views about it.
No, it's fascinating, and I also look forward to know what will be the new sectors we will eventually add.
Coming.
We will start also the Q&A with the public, because we are, this has been fascinating, but let's try also.
Late? Okay.
No, not at all. I mean, you're giving us a lot of
Is
information.
this correct?
Yes,
okay,
it's
very
a
good.
correct
Okay,
one.
perfect. So I check the time.
But to maybe give a little bit more time to the audience to prepare their questions, both here, who would be given a little bit of priority, then also our audience online, I would like to ask a last question.
Okay.
But it's, we have been talking now a little bit about China, but not about the United States. And one of the things that we have seen just in 2025 was first this idea about putting some export control on advanced chips for some EU state members. We have only seen some declarations from President Trump that he doesn't quite like the European regulation, for example. So how are these elements affecting the transatlantic relationship in the ambits of digital and technology?
Yeah, I mean, to be fully honest, it's not new of this administration. We have seen also past administration, maybe with the same presidents, having very strong views about European regulation. But cooperation, at least at the technical level, has always continued. And the typical example I always use is the one of the TTC, apologies, CCT is the competence coordination tool, the TTC, as a forum for cooperation, especially on digital matters. It's true that with the new administration, we have not seen any longer high-level meetings with related conclusions, but work has continued at the technical level. And it's very clear that cooperation and diplomacy at digital level should continue, must continue. One idea that comes from Foresight, to be fully honest, but it's also in the Draghi report, is that of a digital transatlantic marketplace. So an ideal world where the EU and the US could agree, if not on a regulatory convergence, at least on the identification of a series of barriers that could be removed in order to create also a stronger marketplace that would make the access also stronger vis-a-vis, let's say, other systemic rivals. Now, we can also be creative and think that this digital transatlantic marketplace could also theoretically be a digital trans-Pacific marketplace. Why not? This is also a little bit this idea of a third way that some might have perceived in recent speeches of President von der Leyen, for instance, in Davos in January 2025. I mean, a sort of transactional approach. I mean, we cooperate with the relevant partners on an issue-based approach, for instance, with China on climate basis, but of course without compromising on our values. And this might also become more and more important in the future with the US. We have seen, of course, many declarations over the past months from the US administration about especially digital regulation, but the reason is very simple, that this digital regulation, DMA, DSA, AI Act, maybe less the AI Act, tends to apply largely to US companies, especially, for instance, the DMA, it identifies gatekeepers. If we just count the gatekeepers, very factually, we see that the great majority is from the US, simply because the US hosts the famous hyperscalers that, of course, have an entrenched market power, which is exactly what the DMA looks at. Therefore, there is an impact that has to be taken into account and taken on board. What is interesting, I mean, of course, we have seen recently discussions about DMA and DSA, and especially DMA fines vis-a-vis some US companies. There have been the first ones. There is also an ongoing discussion with Alphabet, the famous option A and option B. I think it's something is happening in July where this will be discussed. So it's very much an open dialogue. And what I like is this discussion and this debate that happens between the regulator and the companies. Because somehow, I mean, more than just a dialogue between governments, it's also very much a dialogue with the companies that in some cases have the same power as states. These are big companies, big operators, and therefore I think the idea of the AI Pact is a very powerful one. How to make sure that we can involve more and more the companies in the regulation and learn from their way of implementing regulation in the future. There has been a question recently on Monday to EVP Verkunen, is the DMA, DSA part of the trade debate? And she said no, so if she said no, I say no, as she said. I think these are two different discussions, if this was your implicit call. But I think there is a need more and more of a dialogue. The willingness is there. I mean, we have seen, for instance, that we have now a digital envoy of the EU, which is the head of the EU office in San Francisco, which also signals this willingness to have sort of on-the-spot diplomacy in digital issues. Or we have seen the new international digital strategy that aims at coordinating better digital diplomacy and avoid the fragmentation and overlaps. I think the signals are pretty clear. I think it was good the fact that in the past Europe, if you wanted the international digital strategy is the equivalent of the European economic security strategy in the digital world. And in the past, the European economic security strategy was very much country agnostic and country neutral, but we always said, there is this deafening silence. It doesn't mention any country, but we think that Europe refers to China. And now we're not so sure anymore. So the provisions that are there apply to everybody. And I think the third way is exactly this. Europe wants, and it's also the third way is very much open strategic autonomy. It means exactly this, being as open as possible, as autonomous as necessary. It means cooperating with whoever is willing to respect our rules and our principles, but at the same time boosting our partnerships wherever they are useful and important for us, because openness is part of our DNA. So for me, this is fully in line with this, if you want, this principle of open strategic autonomy that is very much a geopolitical aspect. It's not only inward-looking, but also very much outward-looking.
So now, I don't know if there's any question. You can just raise your hand. You'll be given a microphone. Yeah. Maybe here. He was the first one.
Questions? Yes.
Maybe we will take like 3, and then we'll do
okay. By 3.
Thank you. I just had one question, and it's about now that we are talking about Draghi, China, and the creation of a digital...
Please scream.
Louder?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to ask, Draghi, while we're trying to regulate the use of artificial intelligence in Europe, he said openly that regulation over big tech companies is the higher burden in the union, and that otherwise we should allow major merge of big European tech companies until making up new super technological conglomerates such as Google, Amazon, or Microsoft.
Yeah.
So how is it compatible? In the sense that a few years ago, I still remember when I was studying that we were afraid of a social control system guided by technology and facial recognition, as happens in China. You may correct me, Ms. Arco, if I'm wrong, but now it seems that certain European politicians, such as Draghi, are trying to turn the discourse upside down and justify some way what certain scholars call techno-feudalism, such as the photo of shame of Donald Trump surrounded by big tech magnates instead of national councillors.
What's your name?
Sergi.
Sergi. Okay. If you tell me your name, it's also easy to reply to you.
Thank you.
There were some questions in the back. There were the two next.
Thank you. I'm a third-year international relations student. Thank you very much.
Please scream as well.
Okay. Well, this is a question for Dimitri, although it could be answered for both of you. You've mentioned how the EU is highly dependent on raw materials and in other sectors. And my question is, given the importance of rare earths we're seeing right now, how is the EU planning to integrate Ukraine's resource potential into its long-term plan for digital sovereignty? Thank you.
And the last one that was on the back too?
Thank you very much, Dimitri, to have you here. It's been a pleasure. My question was more regarding quantum technology. You've spoken about it, not in great detail, but you've talked about how it's important to ensure that it's secure, since it's one of the technologies that for the future will be crucial, as the supercomputing advantages it will give can be a serious challenge to European security. And I was thinking more on the financial aspect of quantum, because I mean, European budgets right now are quite tight. We see that von der Leyen has serious problems with the current one she's trying to approve. And for example, in defense, the word of EU budget and EU loans, EU-scale loans, has been suggested, and now it's becoming more common. Do you think that to not lose the sovereignty of quantum and to protect our sector, the regulation is only sufficient, or should European states push for EU bonds in the quantum sector as well to push forward innovation and not risk losing EU companies, quantum companies, to foreign actors that can use it for malicious purposes? Thank you very much.
I start with the three and then we continue. Okay. Sergen, thank you. You raised a couple of points, related, and I think it also gives me the occasion to clarify some aspects. So it's correct, what you mentioned, that in the Draghi report there is, as I briefly mentioned, a strong reference somehow to regulation being one of the aspects that might potentially stifle innovation. So that indeed Mr. Draghi found at the time that in general, overall, especially tech regulation seems to have been tilted more towards the principle of precaution, and explained that this might also have been an issue of ordering, of sequencing, first defining what you want to do, and then doing the policy to boost it. This, of course, doesn't mean, let's say, hiding the head underneath the sand, as we say in Italian. I don't know if it works here in English, but it's clear that there are some aspects of regulation that should be simplified. For instance, the Commission has announced a digital omnibus that will exactly respond to the need to simplify tech regulation, because Mr. Draghi was clear, we have 100 pieces of tech regulations, and some of them, I can tell you because I had to check them for the Draghi report, date back to the old time of the legacy copper networks and are impossible to read, and there is a need of reviewing this regulation, understanding what really applies, but also what stifles the most innovation. And one aspect that Mr. Draghi highlighted at the time is the potential overlap, especially of the GDPR that was mentioned by Ines in her question early on, with some provisions of the AI Act. And this is why I was actually quite happy that the competitiveness compass, that you remember is the way in which the Commission owns the line to take of the Draghi report and makes it a Commission line to take, which is why I can be here today and talk to you, because we have a Commission line to take on this, takes forward the idea of simplifying the GDPR, and this simplification of the GDPR might also help contribute to the principle of innovation in the AI world, because of course you would simplify the overlap and interaction between the two pieces of legislation. You also mentioned in a second aspect, which is very important for me, which is the merging of European tech companies, and I want to say it because I think this has been one of the most misunderstood pieces of the Draghi report. The Draghi report acknowledges very clearly that there is, in general, a clearly positive relation between competition and innovation, which is the classic one that we all know, and that myself at the time I had lots of discussion with prominent competition economists. Of course, I don't want to reveal the names, but that clarified that in general this is the relation. However, this relation is not linear, and this relation is sectoral. So of course, in different sectors, you may have different dynamics, and in each sector, you may have a sort of curve that links competition, so number of operators basically, and innovative impacts, whereby you have an optimum, maximum number of, or minimum number of operators, depending in which sector you are. In the tech field, especially in the telecommunications field, it was found that Europe is slightly above the optimum number of operators that this nonlinear relation indicates. And this can be seen, but for instance, very simply, I mean, I'm now simplifying, looking at the number of virtual operators, mobile virtual network operators, and mobile network operators in the EU versus those that are in the US or China. In the US or China, you have a handful of them. In the EU, you have various dizaines. So I don't remember the exact number, but 10 times more, imagine. So there is a possibility of boosting some merging while still keeping the positive, competitive, and innovative effects, and without negative effects on the prices for consumers. This is exactly the sentence that I wrote, so it's very important for me to highlight it, that you find in the Draghi report. Why is this linked to the initial discussion? Well, because if you favor merging and you favor innovation, so you restore the profitability of some of these tech groups, they might also become more serious competitors to the US competitors. And this is very important, for instance, when you think about the cloud debate. The Draghi report is very clear that Europe is losing the race for cloud. I mean, if we look at the three hyperscalers, you all know, I mean, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud, they represent over 70% of the world market, but over 70% of the European market. And I always tell my students there is this IKEA paradox. It's very difficult to compete with IKEA because they offer everything at very reasonable prices. So you might be strong in a niche, but it's difficult to create another IKEA, and in the tech world, it's difficult to create another Boeing. China has been trying to replicate Boeing for ages, but they just can't because it requires a significant level of knowledge that is difficult to acquire, and it's difficult to acquire and bring to market at a competitive price. So in the field of cloud, the Draghi report concludes that, well, it may be too late and too difficult for Europe to be able to create its own European cloud. I mean, there have been attempts with Gaia X, Catena X. I mean, let's be honest, they have not been very successful. But we still have the opportunity to create some niche sovereign European cloud using encryption, for instance, in some specific areas where data sovereignty is particularly important, and or we can create edge nodes that allow to keep our precious data in Europe. And who can create these 10,000 climate neutral edge nodes on the European soil? Well, mostly the tech operators, the tech companies, if they had the money to invest in innovation. And this is the logic of the Draghi report in this part that I want to stress, because so if people tell you otherwise, you can tell them, no, someone told me that the good reading is this one. So that's why the Draghi report talks about mergers. There is a link with the advanced technologies. But this is exactly also trying to avoid this techno-imperialism approach that you were mentioning. So I was very grateful for the question because it touches upon various aspects. I mean, facial recognition using AI is forbidden in Europe thanks to the AI Act. Therefore, this is why you want to have your own European AI, and you want to have, and this is now the shift in policy from precaution to innovation, you want to boost your own capacities, and to do so, you need to have the operators, because if your biggest operator is 2% of the European market, life is a bit complicated. On the raw materials, so I haven't asked your name, but the young lady over there, I mean, when we talk about raw materials, rare earths, I told you that the strategy that was already enshrined also in the Critical Raw Materials Act is a three-pronged strategy. In the short term, boost your partnerships in order to diversify your supply. In the medium term, boost your domestic capacities. So check what you have. I mean, you might not have, for instance, rare earths because there are some geological limitations, but look around you. And in the longer term, reduce your demand. How? For instance, via recycling and via the secondary raw material market. Therefore, you mentioned Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is part of this three-pronged strategy, and here we have, I think, with Manuel Shapiro, we have to recognize the forward-looking, foresighty approach of our former boss, who signed a memorandum of understanding on critical raw materials with the Prime Minister of Ukraine at a time in which most people around the world didn't even know where Ukraine was, because it was well before the war. So this memorandum of understanding shows the clear willingness of Europe to partner, which is one of the 3 Ps of the European Economic Security Strategy, not by chance. It's also partner with others in order to reduce your strategic dependencies. And that's how the Ukraine story comes in the picture and is integrated into this. Quantum technologies and money. Thank you. I mean, a very important question. I mean, it's not only about quantum. I mean, quantum is, of course, a very good case because it's always a typical example of a forward-looking technology that whatever tech foresighter will tell you. Let me think if Ines tell me the areas, one area, I mean, you go with quantum because it works. The jury is still out. So we're already advanced enough that we know that, for instance, by 2030, we could have, I think it's called the Q-Day, in which quantum systems will be advanced enough to break the current encryption systems, and therefore we need to find solutions to that. We need to boost our quantum capacities. And you mentioned the aspect of money. So Mr. Draghi gave this number that, also to be fully fair, was a number that we put in the Strategic Foresight Report 2023, a little bit smaller 1 year before. We said 700 billion instead of 800 billion because Mr. Draghi was broader in the analysis. But so these are public and private investments needed per year, 800 billion euros per year. So it's, I'm not exaggerating, let's say, in order to achieve all our strategic objectives. Of course, to do so, you need a significant amount of public money, but, and Mr. Draghi himself clarified it because at the beginning people were saying, he said 800 billion public investment. No, you also need private money. You also need to boost significantly your private resources, and this is where, for instance, and I will never get tired of saying it, the European Investment Bank should do more as the climate bank of the EU in order to attract private capital towards breakthrough innovations. And this is why we need more and more in Europe a strong equity leg or equity arm, which is, I think, is an idea that was pretty strong in the Draghi report, maybe not sufficiently and not fully reflected in the competitiveness compass. There are some references, but here maybe we could also be stronger. We need a strong equity leg, equity arm, call it as you like it in Europe, with a strategic purpose that is able to intervene, for instance, in protection of the companies that are champions in Europe, or of the technologies that could be technologies of the future, in order to attract the private capital that is abundant in Europe. I think Madame von der Leyen said 1.4 trillion euros of savings in Europe, which is much bigger than the US. So the money is there. There is not that there is no money. It's not the money. The problem is that the money is not allocated correctly to the right priorities, and especially not to the right priorities in Europe. And maybe this money goes to the right priorities in the US, which is not helpful for our own competitiveness in relative terms. And to conclude, as regards the public part, what the Commission is putting forward, you might have heard it and read it on the newspapers, is a European Competitiveness Fund. So this is part of the idea to reorganize, make more efficient the European budget, which was found, and this was highlighted both in the Draghi report and in the competitiveness compass, too fragmented across too many instruments, too many priorities, with too many access channels for especially private operators. Sometimes companies come to us and say, which public money, which European money, which European funds can I access and how? I have no idea. There are so many channels. So there is this idea of simplification of a core of the European budget that would be focused on a series of competitiveness priorities. I mean, you have heard the indiscretions. I mean, of course, I cannot be too precise on this one, but there will be some windows, let's say, related to competitiveness, but also some flexibility, because being competitive is also being able to be forward-looking, to be adaptive, to adapt to the new political priorities or new tech foresight priorities that might come and we might not know at the moment. So my reply is, for quantum, I mean, we see the case of China that is putting billions and billions and billions of euros of public money. I think in the future, having this European Competitiveness Fund will make a difference, but we should already learn today what this means, and the step is a first step towards the European Competitiveness Fund, so bringing together the various parts of the EU budget for new technologies and more equity, more attraction of private capital towards these priorities. Let's have time for a second round, because I know that I'm getting closer to the end.
Yes, we'll take 2 questions. I would like you to be very brief. I don't know, do we have anything online? No? So I know that there was another one here at the back and another one around here. So if you can raise your hands again. Yes, here and there.
Hi, so I'm curious on the relationship between increasing our strategic autonomy and the current debates on increasing perhaps member states or the unions.
Sorry, can you speak in the
Sorry,
mic? Because
to increase our security. So I'm curious about the relationship between increasing strategic autonomy and the direct relationship between increasing our defense spending, especially in face of an increasingly unreliable NATO collective defense model. So you mentioned a set of sectors that are key to preserve our technological sovereignty. We talked about AI. I think we even talked about the pharmacology sector. But did the report ever also directly identify military technologies as a key sector in which Europe should become more competitive? I think maybe the epitome would be our atomic defense capabilities. But in general, did the report identify this? Are we tackling it? How are we doing it? And if we're not doing it, why is that?
okay. What was the question here in the middle? I know this guy from a long time ago. I was younger.
We were.
If you were white hair.
We were younger. Hi, Dimitri. No, my question is basically, you touch upon a little bit now on the budget side.
Yeah.
So you've been talking a lot about the strategic and the regulation as well on all these Draghi report and the competitiveness compass. In the competitiveness compass, there is mention as well the competitiveness fund that you just mentioned. Taking into account that the Commission will put a proposal forward on the next MFF.
Yeah.
Just to know what are your views, if you cannot give us any insight, what are your views on how the next MFF should look like, putting together what is a competitiveness fund, if this should go against existing funding like the cohesion or the agricultural policies, or if it should go just merging all the rest of funds that exist in the budget of the EU, or if on the other hand you think that there should be a massive increase in funding, and if so, how? If there should be some more equity, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Difficult question, important question. Maybe I start from this one. There are 2 aspects. One aspect is the aspect of size, and the other aspect is the aspect of how we manage the budget, given the size. So if you look at the Draghi report, well, the first solution by Mr. Draghi is, well, if we look a little bit at the situation in Europe, the EU budget is 1% of GDP and member states' budget is 50% GDP. So in the end, comparing, for instance, with the federal budget in the US, the size is quite different. So the first solution by Mr. Draghi is maybe we should think of increasing the size of the budget, which at the moment seems to be a very complex discussion politically. We should also take into account that somehow the Commission has managed in this mandate to do something quite big. Keep the size of the budget constant, but create Next Generation EU and the RRF, which is a sort of second budget, almost of the same amount, with a significant, if you want, destination clause in order to invest in our resilience by helping member states achieving investments and reforms, milestones and targets that will contribute to this resilience. Now this will come to an end in August 2026, so of course I cannot be too precise, but my question is, what is the gap effect? First you add something, then this something disappears, I mean dies out, and then your budget remains your 1%. What is the macroeconomic effect of this gap effect? Question mark. I put this as a question. So this first one is the size, and we have to be fully honest. Mr. Draghi had put forward the idea of Eurobonds, and this was the very same idea that President von der Leyen, in the press conference in which the Draghi report was presented, said it's very politically sensitive, and we are not foreseeing it. I mean, because she was asked about that in the very near future. So let's see what happens. But at the moment, the debate seems where it was at the time. The second aspect is, given the size of the budget, if we are not able to increase its size, to have a new on-resource decision, how do we manage it? And here is indeed the reply that I gave earlier on about the fragmentation of the budget, but also its focus. How to spend the same money we have better, how to do more with less, or refocus the European budget. Now, the whole discussion on the competitiveness coordination tool, and therefore also the financial coordination, was also linked to the idea of making the budget more efficient, and therefore President von der Leyen highlighted in the budget conference speech, which I recommend that you should all read because it's a very beautiful preview, if you want, of what is coming, that we should have this potential capacity for competitiveness, this flexibility, but also keep national envelopes that would cover the cohesion part, for instance, which of course would remain important, while having a stronger performance-based approach. What does this mean? It means implicitly, I looked at the RRF model and I liked it. I liked that you get the money if you deliver something, if you deliver reforms, you deliver investments that, by the way, ensure that you're spending the money in a more efficient manner. And this is the implicit message. And I replied to the last question because we're late. I'm not a big expert of defense, I apologize, but here I think your colleague has already highlighted what has been done on defense spending. So there, the idea was we need to spend more on defense, linking to your question. 50% of the budget is the one of the member states. Well, 50% of GDP is the national budgets, and therefore the main solution is to introduce a general escape clause for defense spending that allows significant spending at national level, especially in some specific member states, on defense capacities. But what I like about the defense debate is also the smart way that the Commission has found to finance defense spending, for instance, in the form of Rearm Europe and SAFE. So finding these smart solutions to make more of the EU budget. So actually your two questions are linked. The idea of SAFE is, let's take some money from the EU budget, use it as a guarantee, and make sure that this leverages other resources, especially private resources, that we can spend more in defense. And this is how you get to the whole amount of Rearm Europe. So maybe my general question is also, why don't we use something as smart as this, but maybe even in a bigger scale, to do more on a sort of equity fund for Europe, to invest more in our competitiveness, because the two aspects can be linked. And what you mentioned, I mean, the competitiveness priorities, of course, have to take into account, as I said earlier on, security dimension. And here I think the dual-use debate is very important. Of course, I cannot anticipate anything, but an important debate that you find in the literature, in the Hector report, in a European Parliament resolution on the FP10, on the successor of Horizon Europe, is will it allow dual-use spending for research and innovation? Because at the moment, you know that except very, well, there is a small exception for the EIC, dual use is not allowed under Horizon Europe. It's limited to civilian uses. So maybe one solution could potentially be, let's do dual use also with our FP10. I mean, just saying, I mean, this is an ongoing discussion. So I think there are smart ways to link the defense debate to the budgetary debate and do better for our competitiveness. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. This was amazing. A big applause. We will take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 35, and then we'll have the panel discussion. Thank you so much to all of you. Bona tarda de nou. Moltes gràcies per també haver acceptat reduir aquest espai de descans. Ara començarem la segona sessió d'avui. Tenim una taula rodona amb 3 participants, 2 aquí presencials que us presentaré i un tercer acompanyant que ens seguirà online. A la meva esquerra començaré per la casa. Tenim el Javier Borràs-Adumí, que és investigador i editor del CIDOB, on treballa temes de tecnologia i també de la relació entre la Unió Europea, la Xina i els Estats Units en aquest àmbit. A la meva dreta tinc el Miguel Ferrer Jiménez, que és sènior a Digital. I online ens acompanya el Michael Adam, que és cap de Departament de Polítiques Digitals del Servei de Recerca del Parlament Europeu. No sé si el tenim. Aquesta sessió serà una miqueta diferent. Tindrem una primera part on demanaré als nostres speakers que ens donin uns primers outputs i després el que farem serà obrir el debat a la resta del públic. M'agradaria començar per tu, Javier, sobretot perquè ara hem estat parlant molt d'Europa, però justament és curiós perquè quan parlem de competició tecnològica normalment són els Estats Units i la Xina els principals actors que ens venen al cap. Però m'agradaria que fessis una valoració de quina és la posició o les fortaleses que té la Unió Europea en aquests àmbits de tecnologia en comparació amb aquestes dues grans potències, però també amb altres actors, potser potències mitjanes en temes tecnològics, com ser la Índia i el Japó, amb els quals potser normalment no hi pensem tant.
Molt bé, gràcies Inés. Jo intentaré orientar la meva intervenció de manera una mica diferent a l'anterior ponent, que s'ha centrat molt en el tema de competitivitat, dinàmiques internes de la Unió Europea. Jo m'enfoco per la meva recerca més a les parts vinculades a relacions internacionals i les relacions entre tecnologia i geopolítica. I per començar una mica, per posar el marc de la discussió, fa 20 anys, 20, 25, 30 anys, a la Unió Europea no li importava massa si la tecnologia que utilitzava era feta a Europa, era feta als Estats Units. La tecnologia es veia d'una manera, en termes generals, neutral, amb una visió que en el moment era una visió vinculada a la globalització, a un model obert de lliure mercat, i la tecnologia entrava dintre d'aquesta dinàmica i aquesta visió del món. Això era diferent, per exemple, en el cas dels Estats Units o de la Xina, on, encara que fa 20 anys hi havia aquest model globalitzat a nivell mundial, eren dos països que sempre, d'alguna manera, amb més o menys nivell, han vist la tecnologia com un assumpte vinculat sobretot a la seguretat nacional. Aquesta visió més neutralista o més vinculada a la globalització que tenia la Unió Europea va començar a canviar més o menys a l'última dècada. Hi ha hagut diferents punts que són interessants de destacar i aquesta evolució, per exemple, l'explica molt bé un llibre que he llegit i que m'agrada molt, que es diu Underground Empire, de dos politòlegs, Henry Farrell i Abraham Newman. Ells donen alguns moments, alguns fets concrets en què aquesta percepció sobre la tecnologia ha canviat a nivell europeu, però també a nivell mundial. Primer, un moment clau va ser, per exemple, el 2013, quan Edward Snowden va treure a la llum l'escàndol de la NSA, de com els Estats Units estava utilitzant la infraestructura digital per espiar tant a enemics com a amics. Això va ser un primer moment en què la infraestructura digital que utilitzàvem ens vam adonar una mica entre tots que no era una infraestructura neutral, que no només s'utilitzava des d'un punt de vista d'intercanvi de dades, d'intercanvis econòmics, des d'un punt de vista econòmic, diguem-ne, sinó que també podia ser utilitzada des d'un punt de vista polític i de seguretat. I un segon moment que ells destaquen i que és important i que no ha estat tan vinculat a la Unió Europea, però que ha estat un moment que ha desencadenat tot el que ha passat després, són les sancions dels Estats Units contra Huawei, sobretot la limitació a l'exportació de semiconductors i maquinària per Huawei. Perquè això el que va demostrar és que la tecnologia i les restriccions de les tecnologies es podien utilitzar com a arma en la competició geopolítica. I dintre de la Unió Europea, en aquell moment, en el moment de Huawei, també vam tenir un debat intern bastant interessant, que era un debat sobre tecnologia, però era un debat molt polític, que era sobre qui seria el proveïdor de la nova infraestructura de 5G a nivell europeu. El que va passar és que en aquell moment Huawei segurament en molts casos tenia l'oferta més competitiva en quant a preu, però es va iniciar un debat a nivell europeu per part pròpia europea, per temes de seguretat, però també amb pressió dels Estats Units, de que Europa no havia d'utilitzar tecnologia xinesa per a una infraestructura crítica com el 5G, i al final el 5G a nivell europeu sobretot va ser desplegat per dues empreses europees, Nokia i Ericsson. Tots aquests fets van crear una visió molt més geopolítica de la tecnologia a nivell d'Europa. I això va portar una mica al concepte aquest que el Dimitri ha comentat de sobirania tecnològica, que sí que hi ha diferents definicions, jo no entraré en el tema, però sí que el que voldria destacar és que aquesta sobirania tecnològica és complicada, o sigui, Europa està ara mateix en un nivell complicat. Una mica ho ha tractat el Dimitri, però jo donaré una mica més de dades. També vull matisar una cosa, quan l'Inés deia veiem la competició tecnològica com una cosa entre Estats Units i Xina, és veritat que a nivell europeu, sobretot si mirem en quant a dependències tecnològiques, també perquè no vam entrar amb Huawei en l'àmbit de 5G, la nostra dependència tecnològica, excepte en l'àmbit de critical raw materials, com es connectava, és respecte als Estats Units, clarament. En el cas, ja ho ha comentat el Dimitri, però si contem les tres empreses principals d'infraestructura de núvol, Amazon, Microsoft i Google, controlen més del 70% de la infraestructura a nivell europeu. Si anem al camp de semiconductors, el 2020 es va fer un estudi sobre semiconductors que deia que la Unió Europea tenia una quota de mercat del 9%, es va dur a terme la European Chips Act, que en principi el que buscava és que el 2030, si no recordo malament, s'arribés a un 20%, però fa poc va sortir un informe de l'acord d'auditors de la Unió Europea que diu que el 2030 segurament només s'arribarà al 12%. Si anem a un altre camp de tecnologia, que aquest no el domina els Estats Units, però el domina Xina, el camp de les tecnologies verdes, actualment la Xina produeix el 70% dels vehicles elèctrics, domina més del 50% del mercat de bateries, el 80% de la manufactura solar i el 60% en el camp eòlic. Si anem a intel·ligència artificial, el 2024 els Estats Units va treure, segons un informe ara no recordo, és un institut dels Estats Units que investiga desenvolupament d'IA, als Estats Units el 2024 va treure 40 models punters, la Xina va treure 15 i Europa va treure 3. I si mirem en el camp de les Big Tech, de les grans tecnològiques, de les 30 empreses tecnològiques amb més valor del món, només 2 són europees. Tot això, aquestes dades no mostren un escenari gaire positiu, però, i per adoptar una postura una mica diferent a el que es parla abans, es parla molt de tancar aquest innovation gap amb els Estats Units i amb la Xina, però jo crec que una mica per pensar sobre la tecnologia de manera una mica diferent, i és el que proposaré ara amb els minuts que em queden, és que potser de vegades ens hauríem de comparar menys amb la Xina o els Estats Units i comparar-nos més amb potències tecnològiques mitjanes, com poden ser, m'agraden molt a mi els casos asiàtics, com pot ser, per exemple, Japó, Corea del Sud o Taiwan. En el cas d'aquestes potències, elles no han intentat seguir una estratègia com la dels Estats Units o Xina, de, per exemple, intentar dominar de manera massiva alguns sectors, perquè no tenen capacitat, no tenen l'escala dels Estats Units ni el poder econòmic dels Estats Units, però sí que han apostat per un model del que, per exemple, Japó anomena especialització estratègica, que es basa en no intentar dominar totes les cadenes de valor o la majoria de la cadena de valor d'una tecnologia, sinó centrar-se més en dominar certs nodes estratègics d'aquestes cadenes de valor. En el camp tecnològic, les cadenes de valor actualment són supercomplexes. Tens matèries primes que s'agafen d'una part del món, el processament d'algunes d'aquestes matèries es fa a un altre lloc, un component es fabrica a un lloc, l'assemblatge final o el disseny es fa en un altre, però hi ha alguns components i alguns productes en concret que són més necessaris, potser més difícils de fabricar i més irreemplaçables d'alguna manera. En el cas, per exemple, Taiwan és un cas que és molt conegut, però ho ha fet molt bé, ara mateix manufactura el 90% dels semiconductors avançats, però, per exemple, si seguim el cas de semiconductors, Corea del Sud fabrica el 60% dels memory chips, dels xips de memòria. Jo crec que ja ho està fent d'alguna manera, però als Estats Units podria aprofundir una mica més en aquesta idea d'especialització estratègica, perquè, per exemple, en alguns camps ja en tenim. Si seguim amb el camp dels semiconductors, la maquinària de semiconductors avançats, l'empresa que la fabrica és ASML, que és una empresa neerlandesa, és una empresa europea. I aleshores, una mica per tancar la conclusió i per una mica dir en què s'hauria de fixar la Unió Europea, quatre temes. Primer, com he comentat ja, especialització estratègica. Després hem de seguir en el camp de la recerca bàsica, perquè si volem d'alguna manera intentar ser pioners en algunes tecnologies del futur. El Dimitri abans anomenava el tema de quàntum. De fet, de quàntum ha sortit una estratègia europea avui mateix, que el que diu, i això és interessant i pot donar per debat després, és que Europa ara mateix lidera en recerca, però és la tercera a nivell de patents. Per tant, i això em porta al tercer punt que vull destacar, que és que un dels temes importants ara mateix a nivell europeu és com les innovacions, com les recerques poden portar al mercat. Això, per exemple, i això és el que anomenaríem com a difusió tecnològica, com tu aconsegueixes una innovació o una tecnologia, però fas que l'economia, que les empreses de l'economia general se'n puguin beneficiar i d'aquí puguin treure creixement econòmic. Com aconseguim aquestes condicions. I finalment, per tornar al camp geopolític, tu d'alguna manera controlant, com ha fet els exemples que he agafat, Taiwan, Japó, Corea del Sud, controlant alguns nodes concrets de les cadenes de valor, tu no només tens avantatge econòmic, també tens, ara no trobaria la paraula en català, però leverage geopolític, d'alguna manera controlant segons quins àmbits, i això ho estem veient, per exemple, Xina amb els critical raw materials, Estats Units amb el seu control d'infraestructura digital, tu tens un poder de pressió i de coerció geopolítica, que si la necessites utilitzar en alguns moments, la tens allà a la mà, i d'altra banda, si no la tens, algú la pot utilitzar en contra teva. Per tant, si els Estats Units i la Xina estan en aquesta mentalitat que han d'utilitzar la tecnologia com una eina més en aquest món transaccional, doncs la Unió Europea jo crec que també ho hauria de fer.
Moltes gràcies, Javier. Ara m'agradaria passar al nostre ponent online, al Michael. Primer de tot, moltíssimes gràcies per acompanyar-nos avui, sabent, des de Brussel·les, però també trobant un foradet per aquesta agenda. I ara veníem d'una discussió on hem parlat de regulació europea, hem parlat del Digital Service Act, hem parlat del Digital Markets Act, de la llei d'intel·ligència artificial, però no hem parlat ni del contingut ni com s'està implementant. Michael, ens podries explicar una miqueta quin està sent aquest procés d'implementació i quins reptes veiem especialment en aquestes noves regulacions?
Sure, good afternoon, everyone. I hope the sound is okay and you can all hear me. Okay, excellent. Indeed, AI is, as Javier has pointed out, also is of course a crucial element when we talk about sovereignty. We all want, to have strong AI companies also in Europe, and we want to have the framework for that in place. So indeed, I would like to focus on AI policies and mainly on the implementation, because that's where we are at the moment, right? We have the legislation is adopted, now it's all in the details, and there's a lot in the details that is relevant. I'll talk about three things in particular. One, about directly regulating AI under the AI Act. Then, like you pointed out already, other pieces of legislation that also could apply to AI and make the situation maybe a bit more complicated for companies using AI. And lastly, about the AI continent, the vision and the strategy of the Commission, the recent strategy, how to make Europe more competitive in AI. So if you start with the first one, the AI Act, you probably, most of you remember, it was adopted last year. The purpose to create human-centric and trustworthy AI and to have a framework for that and ensure a high level of protection against harmful practices. We have a few definitions we need to know, and we need to understand a bit the framework. So AI systems is a very central definition. That means machine-based systems that are able to infer an output based on an input. And then the AI Act has this risk-based approach. You know, the more you have a risk, the more you have obligations. You remember probably this pyramid of risk, you know. So that's the main logic. And then we have this special animal, which is general purpose AI, which came quite late in the negotiation. It was something that also the European Parliament has been pushing forward quite a bit, you know, and that is, of course, these models, like the models that are behind, for example, a chatbot like ChatGPT that we all know, you know, these models that have so many different purposes that you can't really say what is their purpose, because it depends on the user, right? And then there were specific rules for those systems, and there's a lot of detail that we still need to have now on the implementation level for this to work properly. On the enforcement, I mean, who's responsible for the, let's say, normal AI systems? You have the European Commission and the member states together, and for the general purpose AI systems, it is the Commission who is responsible. Where do we stand on the implementation? As I said, the Act was adopted last year, but the general date when all the rules apply will be August next year, August 2026. On the other hand, some rules already apply, right? We have some rules that are already enforced now, the general rules and the prohibitions. August this year is an important date because that's when the general purpose AI rules will apply, and that is one of the points of focus at the moment for the implementation. Implementation, I think there were two deadlines missed on the implementation, so we are not exactly doing so well in that sense. There was a deadline on 30th of April this year for publication of standards by the European standards organizations. That is something that is needed for AI companies to create AI systems that are compliant, right? They need to know which are the standards before the Act applies fully. So this deadline unfortunately has been missed. Another deadline that's been missed is the publication by the Commission of the final code of practice, and that is something related to the general purpose AI. And as I said, these rules in the Act, they take effect 2nd of August this year. So we would say in the north of Europe after the summer, in the south maybe in the summer, right? But it's very soon, right? We might just be back working when this happens, and we still don't have to go to practice. So so that's not ideal. I think these deadlines are not, you know, they're not crucial in the sense that, of course, the rules in the Act, they still apply, but they're very important to prepare, you know, to know how can a company comply with the rules, to give all these details and make the implementation easier and, in a way, clarify and reduce the burden and provide legal certainty. So in that sense, it's unfortunate that we are running late. That's on the AI Act implementation. I'll say a few things now about the Digital Services Act and a few other pieces of legislation that not everybody has so much in mind when they talk about AI, but they start to be now more in the focus as we realize, oh, they might actually also apply, right? So the Digital Service Act, you will probably remember the purpose to set a safe, predictable, and trusted online environment for Europe. And there's a number of platforms mainly that are covered, online platforms, online search engines, intermediary services, and a few others. And the question recently is, okay, how does AI actually relate to this? There are two scenarios you can imagine. One is you have an online platform already, which is regulated by the DSA, and the rules of the DSA apply. And now they start to use also AI, like, you know, many of the search engines do that nowadays. You know, they use the user ANO, so they'll have the two obligations applied. They will have DSA obligations for the platform and AI Act obligations, and they're not always the same, and they can be duplicating each other. But another question is, can an AI system as such also be an online platform or a search engine? And that's a bit, if we stay with the most famous example, you know, the ChatGPT, for example, the question is that maybe already or becoming a search engine or an online platform? And then that would mean that then, in addition to the AI Act obligations, we will also have all the DSA obligations applied to it. So these are kind of the questions that are getting into the focus. I think it's fair to say there's no clarity on the answers, but this is if you're applying AI, if you're a company, you need to know these things, and this is more and more coming into focus. We have the Digital Markets Act as well. You remember that is more competition-based instrument, you know, to ensure contestable and fair markets in Europe. We have two important definitions there: the gatekeepers and the core platform services. And their AI systems can come in the scope as well. They can be core platform services, and there's even a category in the DMA which is virtual assistants, which seems to, you know, apply to many AI systems that we're using today. There's also search engine or operating systems, so it looks likely that it would fall in this. The big question here is it also, can an AI system also be a gatekeeper, you know? So those that are so important that they basically control the market, and then they have special obligations like they can't cross-use personal data, they can't prevent business users to sell similar services, all these restrictions in Article 5 of the DMA. So that's the big question there. We also don't know the answer, but that is something also, you know, that is on the table. Then we have the GDPR that I guess you all know, you know, private data of our citizens is protected through the GDPR. The AI Act and the GDPR, they have a bit of a difficult relationship. The AI Act refers to the GDPR, and they partially, you know, overlay each other, but it's not clear how exactly. So, for example, one example on which we recently did a publication here in EPRS, you know, you have the special categories of personal data under the AI Act, where, you know, the risk of a bias is to be avoided, you know. So if you don't want to be, you know, opposed to a bias, then maybe the system needs to know some personal data about you. Otherwise, you know, how can it know that there's a bias? So under the AI Act, there would be this logic to use the data in order not to have AI that is biased or discriminating anyone. However, the GDPR is much stricter, and under the GDPR, it seems that it's not so clear that this, what the AI Act wants, is actually legal under the GDPR, right? So this is the type of questions that also would need a clarification. Of course, there's also the broader discussion that we probably come to, whether GDPR as such and data protection as such is something that is hindering AI innovation and AI development. That's a bit, of course, a bigger discussion in the background. And also, just one thing to mention, there's some discussions in Brussels about, you know, maybe you're small, maybe you're not so small, maybe very targeted, but there might be some type of reform of the GDPR that is coming. So that is something a bit, that's the talk of the town here, just to share that also with you. But nothing official. And then two ones, and I'll keep it very short because I'm quite advanced in my time. But just to see, it can get even more complicated. I think you see already, it is quite complicated. You also have the medical device regulation. So if you have a medical device that is covered by that regulation, that would also probably be a higher risk under the AI Act. So you have, again, another piece of legislation that you need to comply with. And then you have the big topic of copyright, of course, and AI, where there's many unclarities, and we don't also know, for example, is the training of AI, is the text and data mining under the copyright directive, is that in that sense then covered by an exception, you know, is it, or is it not? So many of these things are not clear, and there might be also something coming on this. I mean, at least the Parliament has started to work on an own initiative report on generative AI and copyright, and there is some motion there. So you have that also on the radar. I come now to the last section, and I'll keep that short as well. It's a bit to close the parentheses. You know, I mean, we've seen how complicated it is on the implementation level. On the other hand, the Commission has been refocusing to quite some extent, you know, from regulating digital technology and AI to wanting to create the right conditions for AI to actually develop in Europe and to be applied, you know. And that's not totally new. The Commission had always, you know, done the two and set the two, but I think there is an increased focus on this recently under this Commission. And the last piece of the puzzle was the AI Continent Action Plan from April this year. Of course, also following on the Draghi report's recommendation and so on. And there, basically, it's the idea is to make the development and application of AI in Europe easier by providing more computing power, by making the access to data more easy, to have high-speed networks, and to make sure we have the talent, because that's also a big factor, to have the talent in Europe that we need to create and to deploy these systems. There's a lot of strategies under this action plan: apply AI, AI factories, AI gigafactories. There's the Cloud and Development Act that will be coming. There's a new data strategy, and there's experience centers for AI. There's a lot of things in there, but I think these are the main, you know, this is the main direction. And to end, I would just like to say, I think these programs to promote AI, they're important, and I hope that they will be successful. But I think without streamlining the implementation, which was, you know, the first part of my presentation, there probably won't be as successful as they should be. I think both have to go together, and I think there is some cleaning up of the regulatory landscape that probably needs to take place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Ara passaré al Miguel, que és una persona que de fet té com molt contacte amb el sector privat, no? I és un d'aquests actors que ens ha anat sortint durant tota la conversació. M'agradaria que ens poguessis situar una miqueta en què els hi preocupa, no? És justament aquesta dificultat en implementar diferents regulacions, és innovar, és competir amb altres actors internacionals, o és una altra cosa?
Bueno, muchas gracias. Gracias, CIDOB, además, por invitarme. Yo formo parte de una organización empresarial que se llama Asociación Española de Economía Digital, que representa alrededor de 500 empresas muy heterogéneas, pero todas muy vinculadas con el impulso de la digitalización y de un modelo productivo basado en tecnología. Trabajamos muy activamente en el espacio de la Unión Europea, pero también en el ámbito latinoamericano, dadas las diferentes derivadas que tiene el empresariado tecnológico, la industria tecnológica en el país. Levántame la mano si me alargo algo, porque a veces uno no percibe el espacio-tiempo, pero sí, yo partiré desde una aproximación positiva de lo que es Europa, en un sentido de lo que es Europa para seguir desarrollando una industria tecnológica digital. Tiene diversidad de aspectos. Hay un aspecto muy etéreo, pero que creo que es fundamental, que es este soft power que tiene los países europeos, el territorio europeo, para la realización de la innovación, cosas como las que comentaba Javier en el ámbito académico, para atraer talento, para desarrollar talento. Todo eso son drivers de capacidad para crear empresas de base tecnológica innovadora. Nuestra conectividad, Europa está en una posición muy avanzada. Yo creo que los indicadores de desarrollo de la década digital de la Comisión Europea apuntan muy en este sentido, y también cuestiones como nuestras relaciones con el sur global, que también nos dan cuenta de la capacidad de las empresas tecnológicas europeas en estar en una buena posición. Me preguntabas, Inés, sobre un poco las prioridades, preocupaciones de la empresa tecnológica. También haré un poco una taxonomía previa de lo que es la empresa tecnológica europea. Tenemos a la startup, scale-up tecnológica, empresas emergentes, podríamos denominar. La empresa emergente europea tiene unas particularidades diferentes a lo que puede ser una corporación tecnológica, y eso está muy vinculado con sus capacidades de atraer talento, invertir en innovación, y también con su apalancamiento en capacidad de recibir inversión y financiación. Tenemos la pyme digital, que está a veces en tierra de nadie, pero luego tenemos a la empresa tecnológica europea, que yo creo que antes también Javier ha apuntado algunos casos como ASML, tenemos a SAP, tenemos a Amadeus, tenemos a Spotify, aunque pivote entre esto. Lo digo porque a veces las preocupaciones, prioridades de este tipo de empresas pues son diferentes. Luego también, y a nivel, por ejemplo, de España, si analizamos el IBEX tiene una cierta pobreza de representación de la empresa tecnológica. Sí que es verdad que el sector financiero español ahora es muy tech. Si tú analizas BBVA, verás que es una empresa que está siguiendo los mismos dosieres regulatorios que apuntaba Michael Adam en su intervención, DSA, AI Act, GDPR, todo esto, de pronto te encuentras que lo que habla Inditex BBVA está preocupada en su aproximación regulatoria como lo que puede ser Google, con lo que puede ser Meta, lo cual es ilustrativo y muestra cómo la empresa europea se ha digitalizado. Me estoy extendiendo, pero en cuanto a lo que pueden ser prioridades, hay algo que es muy ilustrativo. Por ejemplo, los últimos, y esto lo apuntaba el informe Draghi, los últimos 8 años, una tercera parte de lo que son unicornios, es decir, lo que son empresas tecnológicas europeas que superan la valoración de más de 1.000 millones de dólares, una tercera parte han establecido sus headquarters en Estados Unidos. Si tú analizas, por ejemplo, la capacidad de atraer inversión por scale-ups europeas, empresas que están por encima de los 10 millones o 50 millones, más del 80% de la inversión en Venture Capital que han recibido son empresas estadounidenses en comparación con empresas europeas. Entonces, lo que nos encontramos como prioridades es, lo diré igual en 3 puntos. Inversión, una prioridad absoluta que la Comisión Europea está trabajando es la Unión de Mercado de Capitales. Esto tiene muchas derivadas. La fragmentación implica que la capacidad de levantar inversión por la empresa tecnológica europea está limitada. Esto también se ilustra muy bien en las salidas a bolsa. No hay igual una gran bolsa europea donde recurran las empresas tecnológicas europeas para salir. Normalmente hay una tendencia a irse a Estados Unidos, irse a Londres. Luego, la idea del mercado único digital, que es como pues esto, mis padres en Navidades hablan del mercado único digital, a ver si lo conseguimos, pero la realidad, y esto yo creo que es muy ilustrativo en una ciudad como Barcelona, donde tenemos campeones tecnológicos, tenemos TravelPerk, tenemos Factorial, tenemos Globo, tenemos empresas como Redpoints, como Neuroelectrics, como Filmin, que la realidad es que este tipo de empresas, podría estar hablando de empresas alemanas u holandesas o italianas, en el caso que conocemos más, este tipo de empresas cuando se expanden, cuando salen del mercado, en este caso sur de Europa, España, ven como un mercado más natural irse a Latinoamérica que a el mercado europeo. Y eso, hay un tema igual que puede ser cultural o de dinámicas corporativas del sur de Europa, pero hay una cosa que está muy clara, que es la fragmentación todavía efectiva del mercado digital europeo. Y luego, otra de las prioridades está vinculada también con mercado único, que es el tema de la simplificación y de la desregulación. Es verdad que ahora hay un hype con el paquete ómnibus, con las señales que se han dado sobre una revisión del marco GDPR. No sé si ayer había una carta de 20 CEOs de empresas europeas apuntando a paralizar la implementación del AI Act, como estaba comentando Michael en su intervención. Yo, como representante del ámbito empresarial más tecnológico, formo parte de una organización que lo realiza. Es verdad que hay una tendencia ahora que, en cierto modo, es adecuada, pero tampoco creo que sea exactamente lo que hay que hacer. Es verdad, no nos podemos de pronto ahora cambiar el paso cuando se está avanzando, ¿no? No sé cómo voy de tiempo. ¿Sí? Estos son un poco prioridades respecto a preocupaciones de lo que puede ser el sector tecnológico europeo. Hay una que es una clara preocupación de que se pierda la nueva tech wave o la nueva etapa de la digitalización, ¿no? Esta nueva etapa de la digitalización es claramente vinculada a tecnologías emergentes como IA, semiconductores, quantum. Es decir, hay un nuevo marco que viene y ha sido acompañado en diferentes etapas. Hubo una primera etapa de Internet con una capa muy vinculada a datos, otra más de servicios digitales. La preocupación es esa, que no nos perdamos en todo esto. En eso está muy vinculado como prioridad y está todo interrelacionado con mis comentarios previos a lo que es growth y escalabilidad. Es decir, la capacidad de la empresa tecnológica de escalar. Es verdad que si comparamos con China o con Estados Unidos lo que es el tejido empresarial más de startup, más seed, más empresas emergentes en una fase inicial, los números nos muestran que tenemos un buen tejido empresarial, que tiene capacidad de levantar inversión, pero nuestro gran gap, y lo apuntaba antes con los datos de inversión en Venture Capital, es cuando la empresa quiere escalar. Y con su capacidad, por un lado, de atraer talento de inversión, grandes inversiones, y por otro lado, con su capacidad de competir con campeones tecnológicos de otras regiones. Ahí también se vincula como una preocupación, que lo estaba comentando antes a Javier, nuestras dependencias en materia de tecnologías, cloud, IA, ciberseguridad, quantum. Sobre todo desde que tenemos a un señor naranja liderando un poco la conversación global, ¿no? Es decir, nos hemos acostumbrado igual a una posición más crítica sobre tener dependencias con China, pero la realidad es que ahora se está poniendo en cuestión si nuestras dependencias con Estados Unidos también se tienen que poner en cuestión. Si ahora analizamos cómo el crecimiento exponencial de una empresa de servicios digitales europea, que es un e-commerce, puede ser, cómo son sus dependencias con infraestructuras cloud, porque depende de Microsoft, de Amazon Web Services y todo esto, de pronto ahora hay una reflexión de, oye, ¿podemos depender de esta misma forma? ¿Tenemos que consolidar unas relaciones comerciales normalizadas para que este tipo de empresas no estén en cuestión? Esto es, desde luego, un elemento que ahora mismo pues, genera preocupaciones. Luego, otro tipo de preocupaciones es lo que comentaba Michael sobre implementación. Por ejemplo, en España, en un momento, hace 2 años, se hizo un gran anuncio que España iba a ser el líder europeo como laboratorio de testeo de la regulación europea en materia de IA, creando un sandbox. La idea de sandbox es una de las cuestiones que dentro de las dinámicas por garantías de implementación más lentas de regulación europea, es decir, oye, mientras se implementa o se transpone una norma, vamos a hacer que nuestro tejido empresarial innovador testee marcos de gobernanza y de compliance antes de que se implemente. Todo eso, que suena un poco líquido y difuso, ante el modelo de gobernanza y de regulación de la Unión Europea es súper prioritario que pase esto. Mientras tanto, además, que se creen, pues lo que tenemos en el Barcelona Supercomputing Center, en Barcelona, que se creen infraestructuras público-privadas para que mientras se gobierna la gobernanza y la implementación de normas, haya espacios de prueba. Y otro tipo de conversación o de preocupación es la complejidad estructural que tiene la Unión Europea de promover regulaciones, paquetes, estrategias. Si nos fijamos en lo que llevamos de nuevo mandato europeo, solo en el ámbito tecnológico y de las empresas que nosotros tenemos más interacción, se ha aprobado una estrategia de mercado único, se ha aprobado una estrategia de scale-ups y de startups, se ha aprobado recientemente una estrategia internacional de digitalización y al mismo tiempo se ha aprobado el AI Package, lo has dicho antes Javier, el Chip Act, el Critical Raw Materials Act. O sea, si tú coges todo eso y eres una empresa, no te digo, claro, si eres una megacorporación, vas a tener un equipo de gente competente para procesar y para aprovechar, porque la idea es aprovechar, no es pensar que voy a ser compliance. Pero si tú coges a una empresa de alto crecimiento que está enfocada en innovar, en atraer talento e inversión, pues se te cortocircuita un poco la cabeza y al equipo directivo va a estar mirando igual, no va a estar mirando a Bruselas, va a estar mirando a Silicon Valley, a Singapur o a otros hubs de innovación, ¿no? Todo eso, que es una cosa igual crítica y un poco de bar, ¿no? Este comentario, no, que la Comisión Europea está creando demasiadas cosas y no las entiendo. Pero la realidad es que cuando las empresas están tomando decisiones, la capacidad de entender todo esto es fundamental. Y ya por acabar, y una aproximación también del marco europeo, hay una preocupación, o es una preocupación nuestra, que lo que es importante de promover campeones tecnológicos europeos, en realidad se está procesando con la idea de crear campeones nacionales europeos en determinadas tecnologías. Y en esto Francia es un buen ejemplo. Francia está compitiendo por crear campeones en IA, Mistral, Hugging Face. Nuestra visión de aquí es que no deberíamos estar pensando en esa clave. Deberíamos estar pensando en que haya un Airbus de IA, que haya un Amadeus en servicios tecnológicos, en Quantum. Toda esta aproximación es un poco un planteamiento que no es culpa de la Comisión Europea o de las instituciones europeas, sino de los Estados miembros. Y esto también, y ya por acabar, se nota cuando se están estableciendo acuerdos de comercio estratégicos entre la Unión Europea y países como Corea, como Japón, como India. Al final están estos acuerdos, pero la realidad es que son los países de la Unión Europea los que están avanzando en acuerdos comerciales en materia de tecnología de manera avanzada. Y eso también, en el fondo, genera un hándicap, porque si Francia está estableciendo un marco comercial avanzado en tecnología con India, pues no estamos aprovechando igual que eso debería ser desde una aproximación más de todos los Estados miembros con una fortaleza de negociación y de oportunidad para la industria tecnológica europea, ¿no? Y perdonad si me he extendido, pero un placer.
No, ha sido fantástico, creo que nos has traído una voz, bueno, voy a canviar al català de nou, una veu a la conversació molt necessària, és a dir, per exemple, no, aquesta etapa amb els Estats Units potser no s'ha parlat abans amb tanta sinceritat com ara s'ha agraït, i justament potser volia agafar una de les idees que ens has llançat sobre el sud global, no? I això us ho vull preguntar una miqueta als tres. Parlàvem d'aquest Brussels Effect abans, amb aquesta capacitat de normatiu amb el sud global. M'agradaria que des de les vostres perspectives, des d'aquesta, per exemple, competició geopolítica, quin paper pot tenir el sud global per la Unió Europea en quant a això, amb aquesta competència. Michael, si tu ens pots parlar, per exemple, quin impacte ha tingut la regulació europea amb el sud global, si hi ha hagut algun, si hi ha queixes, si el AI Act, per exemple, pot ser vist ara com un model que altres països poden seguir, i des de l'àmbit empresarial, quines oportunitats neixen també del sud global.
Jo crec que és interessant, o sigui, sempre és interessant des de la Unió Europea veure què estan fent altres regions del món. I aleshores, per posar un exemple concret, i no vull dir que aquesta sigui l'opció que jo escolliria, però tornant a un camp que comentàvem abans, que és el de la infraestructura de núvol, ahir llegia un paper que parlava de sobirania computacional en IA. I deia una mica, pots tenir sobirania a diferents nivells. Pots tenir sobirania en el sentit que el centre de dades el tens en el teu territori, en la teva jurisdicció. Pots tenir sobirania en el sentit que el centre de dades és de propietat d'una empresa nacional. I l'última sobirania, que aquesta ja és la que només la té un país, tenir sobirania sobre els xips, els GPUs, que estan dintre d'aquest centre de dades. si en aquest paper s'analitzaven diferents nuclis de núvol a nivell internacional. Qui en tenia més era, vaig comptar-los perquè anava per país, és la Unió Europea. Però després, si anaves a veure qui tenia la propietat d'aquests centres de dades d'IA, la majoria a nivell europeu eren Estats Units. Però l'interessant era quan anaves a altres regions. La idea era una mica què estan fent altres països, per exemple el sud-est asiàtic. Estan apostant per tenir centres de dades d'entrenament d'IA propietats només d'empreses dels Estats Units, només de Xina, dels dos països, i allà trobaven models bastant diferents. Per exemple, si t'anaves a Singapur, la meitat eren dels Estats Units i la meitat eren de Xina. Si t'anaves a cas d'Indonèsia, el que tenien era una empresa xinesa. Anant a un altre lloc del món, si t'anaves a Aràbia Saudí, tenien una empresa xinesa. I fins i tot, si t'anaves a nivell europeu, per exemple, era curiós, i jo no coneixia que Alemanya tenia 2 de xineses. Aleshores, per què parlo d'això? Perquè ara mateix una mica part del debat està en com ens, davant del risc, com ens diversifiquem. La meva, no sé si impressió, la meva intuïció és que a nivell europeu no hi ha l'incentiu, ni hi ha l'impuls, ni hi ha les ganes de diversificar-se portant a empreses xineses, ni a infraestructura xinesa. El problema és com et diversifiques llavors. O sigui, mentre tu estàs intentant aconseguir aquesta sobirania tecnològica i intentes, diguem-ne, tenir, per exemple, en el cas de Núvol, més empreses europees que formin els teus centres de dades, per exemple, d'entrenament d'IA, en aquest temps d'intentar aconseguir-ho i construir-ho, què fas? O sigui, apostes per una diversificació que d'alguna manera té un component conflictiu a nivell geopolític, perquè diversificar-te en segons quins actors et pot posar altres en contra, o et quedes en una mateixa posició. Aleshores jo crec que aquest és una mica un debat que es pot tenir a partir del que està passant al sud global i, per exemple, al sud-est asiàtic, com per exemple, és que el cas de Singapur per mi és molt, és un país petit, però és un cas molt interessant, perquè és un país que sempre, d'alguna manera, ha pogut mantenir bones relacions amb els Estats Units i amb Xina. I està beneficiant-se de les tecnologies d'ambdós països i està jugant un paper entremig bastant interessant. Aleshores, ni que sigui parlar amb gent d'aquests països, veure quina és la seva perspectiva, com ho veuen, com han mesurat els riscos, jo crec que pot ser molt interessant. O sigui, com he dit abans, no mirar tant només als Estats Units i a Xina, sinó mirant què estan fent a altres bandes del món.
Michael, do you want to go?
Is there a question to me? Okay. Yes, thanks for the floor. I mean, in terms of the Commission, yeah, I mean, I'm not the Commission spokesperson, so I cannot really speak for them. But what I do think is that on the Brussels effect and the Global South, I think when it comes to AI, it is to be seen. I mean, the Brussels effect is not a given, right? I mean, we had it clearly with the GDPR and in the data protection area. We start to see it also to some extent with regard to platform regulation and Digital Services Act. With AI, my impression is that the game is still quite open. It's much more disputed. I think the approach of the EU with regard to AI is much more disputed than in the other two areas. And also, let's say the regulation also in the AI Act, I think is much more is much more, you know, soft in the sense that it's very early times for AI. So there's not this like the DSA that would set a precedent, and where the rules are also like very defined. Plus, we have more there's more regulatory competition in the field of AI. I feel also, including from the US, there's much more, you know, opposition, I think, to what we do than there was at the time when the Digital Services Act at least was adopted, for example, or when the GDPR was adopted. So I don't think the Brussels effect is a given. When it comes to the role of the Global South in general, I think, well, Brussels effect we've seen. There is, I mean, the Commission, of course, does a lot of work. I do say that, although I'm not a member of the Commission. They have the Global Gateway, which is a quite big program to help the Global South to develop digitally. And in that framework, we also sometimes have, you know, meetings with representatives from the countries that are part of that program. And I do hear more that I think for AI, they see it a bit early. They tell me often, you know, we have basic connectivity needs first. We have really first other fish to fry. So in that sense, it's maybe a bit early to say what the AI Act would mean. But I think the fundamental question is a bit when it comes to regulation in AI. I mean, we have these, and that was mentioned a few times today. We have these different approaches. We have the EU approach, which is human-centered and values-based, and we have other approaches that compete with it. And we have the US approach, much more industry-based and much more, you know, let the industry develop and then we see. And we have the Chinese approach, which is clearly seeing AI as part of, you know, a tool to control and oversee basically the population. And I think it is a choice to be made by the political leaders of other countries, including in the Global South, which of these models they want to choose for their countries and for their populations.
Thank you.
Bueno, yo igual puedo comentar una experiencia o un proyecto en el que mi organización está a día de hoy activamente trabajando. Adigital colabora con el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, particularmente con el Big Lab, que es su unidad de innovación, en un proyecto a 3 años dirigido a promover modelos de gobernanza responsable en IA, en las principales economías de América Latina. El planteamiento de esto es porque una de las cuestiones que como organización empresarial hemos aprendido es que, y creo que Michael lo ha comentado antes también, sobre el tema de estándares, sistemas de autorregulación, certificaciones. Uno de los grandes elementos para ayudar a las empresas a que sean competitivas y que la complejidad regulatoria no les reste competitividad es desde la industria crear estándares que de manera dinámica les preparen para que eso no sea un bottleneck o que sea un freno a su apuesta en innovación. En esa experiencia, mi organización ha creado un estándar basado en los criterios de OCDE, en el AI Act, en UNESCO, en todo lo que son el marco multilateral internacional de gobernanza de IA responsable, y el Big Lab identificó que esos modelos pueden ser interesantes para promover en América Latina. Lo interesante aquí es que si una empresa en América Latina integra modelos o certificaciones o sellos o estándares de IA muy basados en lo que hay en Europa, está de pronto preparándose para poder entrar también en un mercado como es el europeo. Es decir, hay una oportunidad de que no solo en países del sur global gobiernos integren modelos de regulación europea, sino que los inversores o las empresas locales puedan integrar estándares que ya están basados en lo que ha pasado en Europa, ¿no? No sé si me estoy explicando bien, pero esa reciprocidad, desde nuestra experiencia, es interesante, es competitiva y aparte se adelanta a lo que pueda hacer un gobierno nacional de esos países, ¿no? Que haya otros canales. Y hay organizaciones como el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, nos hemos dado cuenta que son actores rápidos para promover eso. Y eso al final tiene un componente de geoeconomía interesante desde el punto de vista europeo y desde el punto de vista de las empresas de nuestro país o de la Unión Europea.
Muchísimas gracias. Ahora abriremos también al público. Esta vez me sabe mal, voy a dar prioridad a online, pero otra vez, jugando mis privilegios de moderadora, me gustaría que os pongáis un poco el sombrero de Policy Advisors y me digáis 2 puntos para la comisión de decir, estas son las 2 tareas que tienes para los próximos 6 meses.
Yo, pues, considerar a la empresa europea tecnológica como un asset de diplomacia económica. Yo creo que cuanto más haya una interacción entre lo público y lo privado en este sentido, los intereses son comunes. Y luego, no solo pensar en simplificación regulatoria, sino en una adecuada conexión de todo lo que se está haciendo, porque parece que todo lo que se habla es regulación prescriptiva, pero se está haciendo política europea favorable a la competitividad, crear instrumentos ultraconectados con los hubs tecnológicos y con las empresas emergentes, como puede ser el caso de una ciudad como Barcelona, donde sabemos que hay muchas empresas que saldrían beneficiadas.
Michael, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. If I understand correctly, it's for the top priorities, like what we would like to see from the Commission, right? So let me answer from the Parliament perspective. I mean, there is a draft report in the Parliament in the committee, Industry Committee, which has recently been adopted. It's not yet voted in the plenary, so it's not finalized. But I'll give you a bit of an idea of what were the main points that were being discussed in that context, and I think that gives you an idea of what the points that the Parliament is reflecting on. It is to call on the Commission to develop a comprehensive policy, to list critical dependencies, to simplify rules, including telecommunication, to strengthen public-private investments mechanisms, to include venture capital, something we heard quite a bit in our capital markets, venture capital, and create a single point of contact to simplify the procedure for private sector access to EU funding. So that to give you a bit of an idea of Parliament's perspective. Thank you.
Vale. Jo molt ràpid, els 2 temes principals per mi serien com aconsegueixes que aquesta recerca i innovació, ja ho he dit abans, però com aconsegueixes que aquesta recerca i innovació es difongui a l'economia general, perquè això, de fet, l'altre dia parlàvem d'aquest llibre, però hi ha un investigador que es diu Jeffrey Dean que ha investigat una mica com la tecnologia s'ha relacionat amb l'auge de diferents superpotències al llarg de la història, i el que una mica ha trobat ell amb la seva investigació és que no tant les grans superpotències que han aparegut, el Regne Unit, Estats Units, etc., han estat només pel seu nivell d'innovació, sinó sobretot per la seva capacitat de difondre i utilitzar la tecnologia, les noves tecnologies que van aparèixer en cert moment, la màquina de vapor, l'electricitat, a nivell general, a nivell de l'economia general. Aleshores, primer pensar des d'aquest àmbit, i segon, que primer seria com utilitzar la tecnologia per créixer, i segon, com utilitzes la tecnologia per protegir-te geopolíticament, que és el tema una mica amb el que hem començat. Com aconsegueixes? Com pots pensar una mica estratègicament com utilitzar les cadenes de valor tecnològiques com una eina per protegir-te, per protegir la teva sobirania i el teu sistema i la teva economia, i a vegades també com les pots utilitzar com a eina de pressió en segons quines circumstàncies i en segons quins conflictes.
No sé si tenim alguna pregunta a la sala. Aquí n'hi ha 2, 3, 4... Farem el mateix que abans, agafarem una ronda de 3 i després 3 més. Aquí hi havia una.
Primero, muchas gracias por todo esto. Mi pregunta es alrededor de los trabajos y la inteligencia artificial o estas nuevas tecnologías. ¿Cómo se va a hacer para regular, para que las personas no sean reemplazadas por estas nuevas tecnologías? Y cómo esto va a afectar a la economía de la Unión Europea. Gracias.
Hola, gracias por la charla. Mi pregunta iba más hacia Michael, así que si la lanzo en inglés mejor, ¿no? Supongo. So basically my question's around AI policy and media. I'm sure as you've seen and all of us have seen, there's a lot of content now being generated, whether it's like speech content, video, or images, right, in which they're becoming more and more realistic over time. So the question's around whether there's any specific measures or policies that the EU is trying to like implement to basically combat this, because we can see that maybe like at civil society it could create a lot of like radicalization, and then when it comes to like state policy as well, like there could be a great escalation if there's like confusing like misinformation. So how's the EU planning on tackling this? Thank you.
La meva pregunta seria més a nivell tècnic i seria de la compatibilitat entre el concepte de sobirania digital i la convivència público-privada de la cual hablaba usted, señor Ferrer, ahora hace un momento. Por un lado, yo que estoy tomando una formación profesional en transformación digital en España, dirigido a pymes, que es la mayor parte del tejido industrial, se habla de innovación, de automatización, interoperabilidad de datos, pero no se habla nunca de romper con los instrumentos que se utilizan hasta ahora. El instrumento por excelencia para la gestión de datos, Excel, lo mismo para los lenguajes de programación, Python, R, SQL, todos vienen de fuera, así como las principales agencias y consultoras para transformar digitalmente el sector público serían multinacionales extranjeras como NTT Data, proveniente de Japón, o Deloitte Digital, proveniente de Estados Unidos, por lo que realmente, ¿hasta qué punto sería viable hablar de soberanía digital si seguimos dependiendo de grandes magnates tecnológicos que son los que tienen los recursos, sus propios recursos para hacer esto realidad? Y ya que hablaban del sur global, si nosotros tenemos dependencia, ya no hablemos de estos países, porque estaba pensando en el caso de Zambia, que abrió, digamos, los brazos al modelo de ciudades inteligentes como parte del proyecto Belt and Road de China, y a la larga se vio como el propio presidente Lungu utilizó esto para boicotear, en un intento de boicotear las elecciones en el ámbito digital, apagando todos los sistemas, evitando que la gente saliera a votar, persiguiendo opositores políticos. Y lo peor es que se vio que gran parte de los actores implicados, actores no nacionales, eran grandes empresas tecnológicas del país que habían sido vendidas a capitales chinos como Huawei. Ahora estábamos hablando de la gobernanza, ¿no? En América Latina, dirigida desde un modelo regulado europeo. ¿Pero qué mecanismos? ¿De qué mecanismos disponemos para evitar que una situación así como la que se vivió en Zambia se repita en países como Honduras, El Salvador, al mando de Bukele, u otros?
Yo hago un par de apuntes. Un poco el tecnológico de sustitución de personas y demás. No soy tequi, o sea que seguramente vaya a caer en el territorio del disparate, pero yo creo que faltan datos. Es una de las, o sea, la IA forma parte de un hype, ¿no? Antes mis padres hablan del mercado único digital, mis padres hablan de IA y todo el mundo hablamos de IA, y eso a veces genera un poco de confusión sobre su aplicación práctica. Es verdad que además se aproxima un discurso distópico, en nuestra opinión, ¿no? y menos de productividad, de eficiencia, de lo que puede aportar para el sector público, para el sector privado. Esta idea de que faltan datos lo vemos porque todavía no hay claridad de cuál puede ser el efecto de sustitución, pero por decir algún informe reciente, que no me acuerdo ahora la referencia, que analizaba el uso de IA por parte de la PYME europea, y lo que se está viendo es que mayormente las pymes utilizan ChatGPT, y esa es su interacción a día de hoy con la IA. O sea, es una capa muy de... usas ChatGPT, Slack, Gmail, o sea que todavía hay una aproximación básica. Sobre lo que comentabas de soberanía tecnológica, y desde mi punto de vista, y lo que comentaba antes sobre olas de desarrollo de la digitalización, olas de desarrollo tecnológico, yo sí que creo que no nos tenemos que hacer trampas pensando que a priori en los primeros 5 años tenemos que tener un nuevo Google, o que nos tenemos que ir hacia atrás para que haya un Python, un Microsoft, una Amazon Web Services. Creo que esta idea de dependencias e interdependencias y de relaciones en un panorama en el que hay países que han sido aliados naturales, como las relaciones transatlánticas que hemos tenido, eso no impide a que haya relaciones comerciales estratégicas con empresas tecnológicas que están apostando por Europa. Y eso, por ejemplo, en España estamos viendo como Microsoft, AWS, IBM están invirtiendo fuerte en el país, en el territorio, y sus relaciones también con los reguladores, si son compliance, si son avanzadas, no nos tenemos que tirar o poner palos en, no sé decirlo bien, no nos podemos hacer la zancadilla y pensar que tenemos que obviarlos, sino que igual hay que construir relaciones y que Europa en esta nueva ola tecnológica juegue un papel gracias a inversión, gracias a colaboración público-privada. Esa es mi visión en este sentido.
Michael, do you want to go with the second one and maybe also the first?
Yes. Yes, thank you. I mean, on all three very, very relevant and big questions. I mean, on the first one, I start in the order, the replacement. I mean, the regulation we have is, as I said, is the whole approach is human-centered. The human is at the center of that regulation. Now, there is no general clause that says no task that a human carries out can ever be done by AI. I mean, there's not this, like with other automatization. Also, we don't have laws like this, but it is, the idea is to make sure that no harm is done to humans, and that when it's critical AI, that there's human in the loop, and that there's a certain control. There's specific rules also, as concern, of course, health of individuals that can be at risk, and also for the democracy, and that links a bit to the second question on the deep fakes, right? And this is, I think we probably all agree that it's a very worrying trend we have with a large amount of deep fakes that are online, and the difficulty to detect and take them down in time. And so the question was, what is the EU doing? My answer is twofold. I think, first of all, there are rules against this in place. I mean, this is something that under the DSA, for example, is a practice that has to be avoided. Online platforms have obligations to detect and take down that content. Under the AI Act as well, this is something that is not allowed. But in practice, there is, again, we come to the implementation. It seems very difficult to implement that quickly enough, and it spreads very fast. And I think there's a bigger question. That's the second part of my answer. I think regulation is one thing, and I think that shows you why we have certain value-based rules in Europe, because there's certain things we would like not to have. But it doesn't mean that when you make a law and then the problem is gone. I mean, there is still, on the ground, there is still this problem, and there's a bigger thing even behind, which means we're going towards the sanity of the internet as such. I think is changing, is at risk, because we have so much synthetic content that's growing exponentially, that in a few years probably the projection is that there might be more synthetic content than actual content on the internet. So we need to go towards, you know, a way of using the internet differently than we do now. That's much bigger, and that's for all of us. That's not just for the regulators. I think we need more literacy, like we know with media and things like this. You know, people will need to know how to find trusted sources on the internet. There are many initiatives also, including from tech companies, by the way, also to work on this, to have, you know, make sure trusted content can be seen, can be identified on the internet. But I think it's a huge task, and it's very early and very early days, and it's going unfortunately very slowly, and the spreading is going very fast. So I think there's a huge task ahead for all of us. And on the third question, on the sovereignty and the big tech, I would like to believe that we're a bit in a transition phase. Because the description was, of course, correct. I mean, we're dependent in Europe in many aspects. If you talk about cloud, for example, we're dependent on very few, very big players. That doesn't mean that cannot change. I mean, that I think that there are certain things we can put in place. Maybe scale is also not everything, right? If you have a good solution, maybe you don't always have to be the biggest one. But of course, there is a challenge, and I quite liked actually the concept early. I think it was you, Javier, you know, who explained us how the Japanese do it with a strategic specialization, right? I think the situation we're in, we're not in a situation where we can say we do it all ourselves and we don't need anyone. We're just not there, even if it would be great. So I guess we need to do something like this, at least for this phase now, identify the strategically important areas and try to build what's necessary to build at least these important pieces. And working with partners is, I think, still part of it. So I think we will need partners. Hopefully we have enough that are like-minded. Thank you.
Yo iré a la pregunta de lo del empleo porque es bastante interesante. Primero es bastante interesante que los primeros reemplazados han sido los programadores, en buena parte. Después, un poco yo también estoy de acuerdo de que ahora mismo no tenemos demasiadas como evidencias de qué empleos se van a desaparecer, cuáles se van a crear, cuál va a ser un poco el balance final, pero creo que es interesante ver como los grandes focos de poder tecnológico, cómo piensan sobre este tema del empleo y el futuro. Hace unos años, un poco, cuando Silicon Valley era más liberal y tenía una imagen un poco mejor, la idea era que al final, o sea, su escenario ideal era déjanos hacer tecnología, no nos regules. Seguramente la tecnología acabará reemplazando la mayoría de la población, pero tenemos un mecanismo que lo solucionará todo, que es la renta básica universal. Se la damos a todo el mundo, os quedáis sin empleo, pero no pasa nada porque seguiréis recibiendo algo que os mantendrá y además no tendréis que trabajar y todo será maravilloso. Un poco era el discurso utópico que es lo que dicen y lo que decían, y yo creo que mucha gente todavía lo piensa. Entonces hay la versión dark, que es lo que ha hecho Elon Musk en Estados Unidos recientemente con Doge, que es la IA es mucho mejor que todos estos burócratas que están en el gobierno de Estados Unidos. Empezamos a despedir gente, cogemos todos los datos, escapeamos todos los datos que tiene el gobierno, los metemos en nuestros sistemas de IA y de ahí saldrá algo mejor. El resultado ha sido un poco caos y que, bueno, un poco caos no, un caos bastante importante. Al final Elon Musk ha salido del gobierno y yo creo que un poco lo que ha demostrado el proceso es que, bueno, que esto era totalmente un experimento y que yo creo que cuando hablamos de IA no solo hay el tema de que la IA sea más efectiva que el humano. Es que porque una tecnología sea más efectiva, eso no hace automáticamente que se vaya a implementar. Hay unas barreras institucionales, humanas y sociales que limitan bastante la adopción de según qué tecnologías. En el caso de Estados Unidos, porque pasó este contexto muy singular y especial. Pero, por ejemplo, con lo que tarda, por ejemplo, la administración pública a nivel español o a nivel europeo a hacer según qué cambios, es que para que implementen la IA y sustituya a muchos trabajadores públicos, yo creo que todavía queda mucho, hay muchas barreras institucionales y también humanas de oposición a ello, por tanto no creo que vaya a ser un problema fácil, incluso si al final la IA fuera algo más productivo y que a nivel económico tuviera más sentido. Y para ir a otro lugar del mundo, el otro polo tecnológico, ahora en China está habiendo un debate bastante interesante de que la IA y la automatización quizás es la solución al problema demográfico que tiene el país. Que quizás no hará falta, como ha pasado en otros países, por ejemplo, que haya menos restricciones a tema de inmigración, que se tenga que, por ejemplo, fomentar más la natalidad, todas estas opciones, los métodos habituales que se decían para compensar el problema demográfico, que quizá la tecnología puede ser la solución. Y ahí cada vez yo estoy leyendo más a expertos chinos, incluso desde algunas partes de funcionarios y del gobierno chino, que ven como una opción bastante factible la automatización para contrarrestar este problema.
Vamos a hacer una segunda ronda, ahora sí, dando prioridad a los compañeros que están online. Y después no sé si tenemos alguna pregunta más en la sala. Y otra ahí, vale, perfecto.
Vale, moltes gràcies, Inés. Dos preguntes molt específiques. La primera és si la Unió Europea té la capacitat per competir amb la manera de fer negocis de la Xina en inversió i explotació de recursos tecnològics essencials al sud global, especialment en els països de l'Àfrica subsahariana. I la segona és la pregunten què cal fer perquè els mercats digitals no continuïn tan fragmentats i si Espanya té potencial per exportar la seva experiència en l'aplicació de processos d'IA a Amèrica Llatina o si ja ho fa.
First of all, thank you very much for this. My question is especially to Michael, but if any of the panel can answer, perfect. Given the European Union emphasis on the responsible AI through the frameworks like the ones we've mentioned today, I come from a politics, philosophy, and economics background, so I would like to ask about the issue of accountability and the ethics of AI. Basically, as AI systems become more autonomous and are embedded in critical decision making, how does the European Union envision the allocation of the responsibility when these systems cause certain failure, unexpected failure, and what happens with this? Like, who is ultimately accountable for the problems with AI? And in a more broad aspect, how do the ethical concerns around transparency translate to the concrete enforcement mechanisms that both the European Union, and to the member state levels?
Buenas tardes y gracias a todos por sus intervenciones, todas muy llenas de inquietudes, ¿no? Y de reflexiones. Mi pregunta va enfocada básicamente si dentro de todas las regulaciones o todos los programas que se están implementando, ¿existe alguna rama que trate el uso de las IAs tanto sobre todo para restringir o para combatir el uso de estas nuevas tecnologías en lo que tiene que ver con la actuación del crimen organizado, como por ejemplo el combate a lo que sería la pornografía infantil, todo lo que tiene que ver con los niños, o por ejemplo a los problemas de la uberización de las drogas que se están dando, por ejemplo, en el sur de Francia, ¿no? Donde ya tienen cada vez un sistema mucho más sofisticado con respecto a lo que es, ¿no?, la promoción de las sustancias psicoactivas dentro de la población, de la cual digamos que en España tampoco no estamos exentos. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, yo responderé a la a la de online, aunque quizá lo ampliaré un poco más a no solo a África subsahariana. Yo creo que un tema importante que debe plantearse la Unión Europea cuando va a países del sur global es que, o sea, creo que no es suficiente el discurso de lo que ofrecemos nosotros son mejores valores, porque la prioridad para algunos de estos países, en parte quizá está en los valores, y hay muchos otros países en los que precisamente los gobiernos no quieren valores similares a la Unión Europea, pero eso sería un tema aparte. El tema principal está en desarrollo y en desarrollo, coste y capacidad de implementación de tecnologías o de incluso infraestructura básica digital que necesitan. Entonces, si no hay una oferta que sea competitiva en este sentido, que pueda competir en cuanto a desarrollo y a competitividad económica con China, yo creo que no hay, es difícil que una empresa europea pueda ganar ahí. Si hay esta competitividad y además puede ofrecer este extra de valores, de transparencia y de cosas positivas a nivel ético, pues mejor, pero no creo que en la mayoría de países con solo el aspecto de los valores se pueda ganar frente a las ofertas chinas.
Michael, your turn.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll try to go on the first two questions. The first one, how the EU can compete with China in sub-Saharan Africa. I think I come back to what I said before. I think we need to promote our model and explain why we chose it. We need to explain why we think a value-based regulation is good for at least our society, and try to convince those countries that it might be also in their interest. So I think we have that argument, and we need to see whether that is convincing enough. The second question on accountability and ethics, of course, that is one of the really big questions when it comes to concrete, AI in action, right? You have it in a self-driving car, for example, and something happens, and then how do you allocate that responsibility? The question, what is the EU? How does the EU see it? I mean, again, I'm not an EU spokesperson. I can't speak for the EU and not for the Commission, but I can tell you that there was a proposal, for example, for a piece of legislation specifically on that in the last minute, the AI liability, I think directive it was, and that was exactly trying to tackle those questions. Now this was one of the victims of the new approach, omnibus and so on, to have like less regulation. I mean, I can say from the Parliament perspective, there were many members of Parliament who were quite vocal that they want this regulation because they didn't see it as an additional burden, but rather something that makes it more clear and is helpful. But there was between the institutions, there was no agreement. The Commission has withdrawn that proposal, so that is unfortunately off the table. So in that sense, there's nothing coming at this point in terms of new regulation. And about transparency, I mean, in the AI Act itself, you have a number of documentation obligations for providers of AI systems. For example, with regard to copyright, you have also one that is quite far-reaching, that all the training data needs to be made transparent for general purpose AI system. They need to say, this is the data we use to train. So the rules are there. Of course, as you probably can appreciate, that the implementation in practice is not straightforward, because this training has often already happened in the past, right? So there's an obvious difficulty there in terms of practical implication. Thanks.
Doncs amb això concluïm la sessió d'avui. Primer de tot, un gran aplaudiment als nostres ponents. Moltíssimes gràcies a tots per acompanyar-nos avui i demà comencem el tercer dia del curs a les 9:45 amb una intervenció de Jaume Duch, conseller d'Acció Exterior i Unió Europea de la Generalitat de Catalunya. Fins demà.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thanks.